Cultfigga TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. Happy birthday, Cultfigga King. Wow, 45 like the handgun. North Korea defends Venezuela. Epstein has Trump shook. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. But like, share, subscribe, support the platform. Y'all, revolution is a way of life. Revolution is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We got a lot of work to take care of today. But we still got to run this platform. We got to have our geopolitical stream. We got a lot of other streams we're going to do today. But let's get into this. The Venezuela World War III situation. Well, just because it's Cultfigga birthday don't mean your ass might not have to have a war take place. Salute. Life goes on. Let me roll up this good dynamite.
The situation around Venezuela continues to deteriorate rapidly. Everyone's nerves are strained to the limit. Almost all military experts admit that the situation in the region can get out of control at any moment. Excessive nervousness is also felt in the White House. Over the past few days, U.S. President Donald Trump has made a series of stern remarks about the head of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. In particular, Trump said that the United States recognized the Venezuelan government, led by Maduro, as a terrorist organization, and that Washington would use all available means to combat these criminals. Furthermore, the current occupant of the White House called Maduro a real drug terrorist, who is engaged not only in drug distribution, but also in killing people, abductions, and financing terrorism in the region. In addition, Donald Trump also accused the Venezuelan authorities of stealing oil, land, and other assets that, according to Trump, belong to the United States. My dear truth seekers, the fact is that in 2007, when Venezuela was led by Hugo Chavez, Caracas carried out a wave of nationalizations in the country's oil sector, forcing American companies such as ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to start sharing their profits with the Venezuelan oil company PDVSA. At the same time, it is worth noting that Caracas did not confiscate the assets of American companies, as, for instance, was the case in Cuba after Fidel Castro came to power. The Venezuelan authorities simply suggested that the Americans work together and split the profits in half. However, American companies, on the direct order of Washington, refused the conditions imposed by the Venezuelan authorities. As a result, the Americans lost their assets in almost all of Venezuela's oil projects. It is worth noting that American oil companies are still suing Venezuela, demanding tens of billions of dollars from Caracas, as compensation for the loss of their assets in this South American country. Furthermore, several international arbitration courts have even ordered Venezuela to pay compensation worth $12 billion to these American companies. At the same time, it is worth noting that Venezuela has already paid out most of this money. Thus, all of Trump's statements that Venezuela allegedly stole oil and oil fields belonging to the United States are untrue. However, this does not prevent Trump from continuing to threaten Venezuela and taking rather provocative steps. In particular, after Trump realized that the previous round of pressure on Nicolas Maduro had failed, the current owner of the White House moved on to the next step. In mid-December, Trump announced a naval blockade of Venezuela. The U.S. president has officially confirmed that he has ordered warships to detain all sanctioned oil tankers bound for Venezuela and from it. Furthermore, the United States even published footage of the detention of a large oil tanker that was heading to China with Venezuelan oil on board. It is noteworthy that the crew of this detained oil tanker consisted of Russian citizens. Later, U.S. warships prevented several foreign oil tankers from even approaching the shores of Venezuela. Immediately after that, Donald Trump once again issued an ultimatum to the Venezuelan authorities. On December 17, Trump said that U.S. military activity around Venezuela would only grow, and that Washington would not allow a terrorist like Maduro to send stolen American oil to other countries to finance his criminal activities. Furthermore, Trump once again called on Maduro to voluntarily leave Venezuela. Otherwise, the United States would force him to do so through military force. It is noteworthy that it was after this that the famous American journalist Tucker Carlson, citing his own sources in the White House, said that on December 18, Donald Trump would declare war on Venezuela during an address to the nation. However, during the U.S. president's address to the nation, Trump not only did not declare war on Venezuela, but he never even mentioned the name of this South American country. At the same time, many experts noted that Trump was noticeably nervous during his speech. And now, a few days later, it became known why the United States still did not dare to attack Venezuela. As it turned out, immediately after the United States detained an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro ordered the country's fleet to begin escorting all civilian ships in order to prevent further attacks by American warships. And given that Venezuela's fleet consists of only 2 small missile frigates and 3 boats, armed with old Italian Automat Mk2 Block 1 anti-ship missiles, many considered this decision to be madness. However, starting on December 17, these old Venezuelan warships escorted dozens of oil tankers and did not allow American destroyers to detain them. Amidst this context, many experts questioned
they did just steal 2 more oil tankers over the weekend. So the pressure is continuing, and that's why North Korea and Russia are starting to get very pissed about this situation. That the small hats have Trump doing this. That's why they talking about Epstein right now. It's to force the U.S. hand to further wreck our economy, steal all our money that's in your banks and your savings, and say they got to fight this war with Venezuela.
How a relatively weak Venezuelan fleet was able to publicly shame such a formidable U.S. aircraft carrier strike group. In fairness, it is worth noting that even one American destroyer is capable of sinking the entire Venezuelan fleet within a few minutes. However, the Americans not only refused to attack the Venezuelan warships, but also allowed Caracas to break the country's naval blockade. Subsequently, it was revealed that China and Russia provided assistance to Venezuela in facilitating the movement of oil tankers that were stranded in the nation's ports. As it turned out, Beijing exerted tremendous pressure on the United States, threatening Washington with severe consequences in the economic war, in the event of continued attacks on ships with Venezuelan oil destined for China. As for Russia, its warships, armed with modern anti-ship missiles, provided protection to the Venezuelan fleet. It was these factors that turned out to be key, and prevented the United States from sinking Venezuela's old warships during their daring operation to break the country's naval blockade. Nevertheless, I am sure that Washington will not turn a blind eye to such humiliation, and will continue to develop new plans to overthrow Nicolas Maduro and seize the oil wells of Venezuela.
ago, and we want it back, but they took it. They illegally took it.
So incredible. As many Americans and people all across the world, frankly, were imagining what Trump was going to say at 9 p.m. Eastern time, imagining that this would be a declaration of war on Venezuela, we were gifted this amazing video of Donald Trump getting off of an airplane and stating that Venezuela took all of our oil and we want it back. They illegally took it. Can't make this stuff up. Take a listen.
It's a blockade. Not going to let anybody going through that shouldn't be going through. You remember they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil from not that long ago, and we want it back. But they took it. They illegally took it.
So incredible, right? Now, what do I want you to know about this? Well, for starters, you should know, you should probably know this, what the Venezuelan people think, what they feel about this. This is a brand new poll that was given to me today, about 10 minutes before I went live, by Monitor Politico, Venezuelan poll done in Venezuela, polling 2,000 Venezuelans across the country. And this is the state of opinion from the Venezuelan people regarding Trump's statements and threats. Now, the first one, Donald Trump. Let me get the translate out here because, you know, my Spanish is not amazing. I can kind of read some of it, but okay. So the first one, this one right here, it says, "What is your reaction to the assertion by U.S. President Donald Trump that Venezuela's oil and wealth belong to him?" 97% of the people say we reject that. That's literally retarded. Because it is. It doesn't make any sense. How can the president of the United States declare that the oil beneath the feet of the Venezuelan people is his and always has been his? It doesn't make any sense. Just as though it didn't make sense when Bush went into Iraq under the same premise, and the first thing he did when they went into Iraq was say, we are now going to pass an executive order mandating that all Iraqi oil be moved back to the petrodollar. Okay. Now, the second question, threat of a blockade, maritime blockade on Venezuela. What do the Venezuelans think about that? 92% say they reject the idea of a maritime blockade on Venezuela. Now, the next question that is put forward in this poll says, in response to the designation of Venezuela as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, by the United States government, what is your reaction? 98% of the people say that they reject that label and they support the defense of the country. Lastly, the question of whether a U.S. military attack against Venezuela, what would be your main reaction? Well, the reaction of the intervention and support for any means for the defense of the country, or rejection of the intervention and support for any means for the defense of the country, that opinion is held by 90% of the public. 7% of the public in Venezuela said that they would support foreign aggression against Venezuela, and 3% say they consider it a farce. So basically calling the United States' bluff, that they're not actually going to do it. So that's what the Venezuelan people have to say about all of this. And I think that's actually quite important because we are dealing with a sovereign nation, a sovereign people that have the right to determine their own future. And it is not up to Donald Trump to simply say they stole our oil. Now, we're going to break down what he actually means by this. Thomas Massey, I think he did like a Grok AI. I don't know if that's because he doesn't actually know the history here or because he wanted to have a very succinct and concise way of presenting this to the public. But concerning, I guess, if it's not the latter, slightly concerning only because he takes the correct position on this. He said, when Trump says Venezuela stole oil from the United States, he's talking about projects by oil companies that were nationalized by the government of Venezuela 2 decades ago. No one campaigned on using our soldiers to overthrow Venezuela to make these oil companies whole again. So he posts this and says, when Trump says Venezuela stole oil from the United States, what is he talking about? Trump's talking about how back under Hugo Chavez in 2007, Venezuela nationalized a bunch of heavy oil projects in the Orinoco Belt and basically kicked out or forced out American companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. That's actually not true. And I'll just say right now what happened. In the 1970s, the Venezuelan government, which was not a revolutionary socialist government at the time, they nationalized the oil in part in Venezuela. All right. In parts, they nationalized the oil. Now, a lot of the oil projects, major oil projects that were being conducted in Venezuela from that point onward, especially those that had large majority foreign ownership, were in the Orinoco Belt. Okay, this is where like everything really big was happening. Now, I think it was like around a dozen or so, maybe 24. I think it was about like 21 companies back in 2007 when Hugo Chavez was in power, socialist revolutionary leader that understands sovereignty, understands the need for true nationalization of resources. He went to all of these companies that were doing these huge operations in the Orinoco Belt, and he went to them and he said, look, you guys, what we're going to do now is correct the failures of the past. In the 1970s, yes, our government did partially nationalize our resources in Venezuela, but they didn't do what really needed to be done. And what is that? Well, in the eyes of the Venezuelans, and this is actually kind of the de facto idea all around the world, especially when you look to China, when you look to Vietnam, these sorts of countries that have state-owned enterprises. The main idea is that if you have around 2/3 ownership, if the state has 2/3 ownership of a company, you in effect have control of that company. The governments, the people, they have control of that company, not a foreign transnational corporation. But anything less than about 60% is up in the air, because if you have two foreign transnational corporations, they could team up and they could try to screw you over. So 60 to 67% is really what you need to have control of these projects and your own resources. So what Hugo Chavez said in 2007 was, you 20 or so oil companies, major oil companies that are doing work in Venezuela, we want you to stay. Here's what we're going to offer. We need 60% ownership of the various projects that you are leading, and we are going to give you fair market value. We can negotiate. We want to make you happy. We want you to stay and continue doing your business here, but we need 60% ownership. So essentially, the Venezuelan government was saying, we're going to buy whatever we need to get up to that 60% number. And this is our new national policy. It was a constitutional amendment. This was the law of the land. If any company didn't like that, they could leave. They amended their constitution. This is a country 2.5 times the size of Ukraine. It's got like 20, 30 million people. They can do what they want, and they decided to amend their constitution in this manner to protect their own oil. Most of the companies, they went back to Hugo Chavez and they said, that's fine by us, Hugo Chavez and Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan parliament. Okay, we are going to negotiate with you. Chevron did this. Statoil did this. Total Oil did this. We are going to negotiate with you, and we are going to allow you to purchase 60% of these operations, and we will stay and continue doing our business. Okay. So you had well over a dozen of these companies say, we are happy to participate in this new agreement. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were the two major enterprises that said, we'll negotiate, but we can't promise anything. We can't promise that we're going to sell up to 60% of our operations to you and agree to a price, right? The Venezuelan government said, no worries. We understand that you're hesitant about this. You got shareholders to look out for. You want to maybe expand your operations here. We understand you might not be able to come to a conclusion in a negotiated agreement with the Venezuelan state by February. So what we're going to do, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, is extend the negotiation period for like another 6 months or so. So the Venezuelan state said, Constitution, we're going to do a slight amendment for ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, and we're going to allow them more time to negotiate with us. Well, The second deadline came. ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil.
Salute to all the revolutionaries in the biz. I'm going to have several lives today. I need to run this geopolitical information for the geopolitical revolutionaries. And then I'm going to run some live streams later on. I got to stop by the store, get gift cards, passing out gift cards to those in need today. That's how we're doing it on Cultfigga birthday. Revolutionary salute.
Said that they did not like the numbers that were being presented to them, even though every other oil company, basically all the major ones, had agreed to even worse off numbers than ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were being offered. So they left. ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil left. The Venezuelan government, they're like, all right, well, we're going to take control of these operations. And they sent all of their state employees down there from PDVSA, however you say it, the PDVSA, which is their state-owned oil enterprise. And they took control. They all went down there with these red helmets on. It was a day of national celebration. Hugo Chavez was very clear that, we gave them a lot of time. We gave them exceptions. We tried to make a fair deal. They didn't like it, so they left. It was on their own volition. They left ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. So let's keep reading this right here. So anyways, this Grok AI got it wrong. International courts later ruled those expropriations were illegal and awarded billions to the companies, but Venezuela never fully paid up. Now that gets into a whole nother conversation, because the international courts that disputed these cases, which, by the way, Hugo Chavez and the Attorney General of Venezuela at the time, they said, okay, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, if you don't want to agree, we can settle this in international courts. They said, okay. The problem is that these courts were compromised in very serious ways by Venezuela exiles who wanted regime change, and they screwed around with the courts. We can talk about that in a later episode if you want to. But just understand, in the same way that they apply pressure on the International Court of Justice and the ICC to not prosecute Netanyahu for war crimes and say that this is not a genocide, they did the same thing here over these settlements. And they said, the International Court disputing this, basically said that ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were owed billions of dollars. One of the parties was owed over $10 billion. I think it was about $11 billion by the state of Venezuela. Important. The Venezuelan state owed them billions and billions and billions of dollars. So anyways, he goes on to say, he's framing it dramatically as stealing U.S. oil assets or oil fields and tying it to his recent moves like the oil tanker blockade and threats to get the value back. Some folks also point to the recent U.S. court-approved sale of Citgo to help settle those old debts as part of the picture. Now, this is where we get to the most insane part of the story of all. Citgo, you probably know, is just like a gas station, pipeline infrastructure, major energy company in the United States. But did you know that Citgo was actually kind of a subsidiary of the Venezuelan state? Because the Venezuelan state has PDVSA, which I know is not the correct way to pronounce it. It's how do you pronounce it even? It's PDVSA. I got it right. The Venezuelan state has PDVSA. And PDVSA has a board unto itself that is controlled by the Venezuelan government. Now, in the United States, there is Citgo. Citgo is a private company in the United States, which has gas stations all across the country. It had pipelines all across the country. Okay. Citgo is controlled by PDVA Holdings. So there's PDVSA, there's Venezuelan government, PDVSA, and then in the United States, there's PDVA Holdings and Citgo. PDVA Holdings, their board is appointed by PDVSA. So PDVSA is not at all at any point involved directly in the internal day-to-day operations or decision-making made by Citgo. There was never any way for authorities and international courts or even U.S. courts to tie Citgo to the Venezuelan state. So for ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to come out and point the finger at Citgo and say, well, we need to seize Citgo. We need to take their assets. It needs to be sold in a fire auction. We need to liquidate Citgo. and take all of the money for ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips because we are owed money from the Venezuelan state stemming from the 2007 expropriation. It never could have been argued in court. And even the Venezuelan opposition admitted that. But when Trump decided to unrecognize, illegitimize Venezuelan President Maduro in Venezuela during his first term and recognize Juan Guaido and his band of crooks as the new government of Venezuela, the government in exile, guess what happened? The new government in exile, Juan Guaido and his corrupt team of crooks were allowed to have full control over Citgo. They had full control. They were given full rights over Citgo. And this was the official new Venezuelan government in the eyes of the United States government. When that happened, it allowed ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to then point the finger at Citgo and say, well, it's a new government. It's a new Venezuelan government in exile, but now we can directly tie the Venezuelan government to Citgo, sue them, force them to liquidate the company, and steal all of the assets in the process. And that is what has now happened. Why is that important? Well, Citgo was the most precious, most expensive asset that the Venezuelan state held in all of their international assets. Okay. Really, it was a problem for Venezuela they should have dealt with long ago. It was made very difficult to deal with that problem as a result of these lawsuits. But that is what happened. And due to the incompetence and the corruption and the embezzlement of Juan Guaido's government that controlled Citgo, they were successfully sued by ExxonMobil, by Crystal X, which was a mining company that also had expropriation judgments that were being made in its favor against the Venezuelan government. You get the idea. Take a listen to exactly how this kind of unfolded from Anya Parmpil, who's a great journalist who explains this in very good detail. It's an amazing story. And this is what Trump is referring to regarding the story of saying, well, Venezuela's oil is our oil. You can clearly see now that Venezuela's oil is not the oil of ExxonMobil or ConocoPhillips or Donald Trump himself. But this whole operation has allowed ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to be entitled to billions and billions of dollars. This lawsuit decision, this court decision is being appealed. And I think what Trump wants to do here is make sure that ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips get their billions of dollars, as well as Crystal X. But take a listen.
What happened is this year, the Guaido-controlled, legally defunct National Assembly moved to appoint not only the board of directors of PDVSA, but also PDVSA Holding, also Citgo Holding, and Citgo. So that placed a government hand directly in to Citgo, proving Crystal X's alter ego case for them. And within weeks of this move by the National Assembly, Citgo actually filed a motion in court saying that the fact the National Assembly had moved, they used a phrase something along the lines of they had complete disregard for corporate normalities or corporate function by appointing the Citgo board. Through that move, it proved that under Guaido, the Venezuelan government may have more control over Citgo, and therefore their case was stronger. And then sure enough, within weeks, the court rules in favor of Crystal X. And only after that point do we find out that Guaido's attorney general, who members of Venezuela's opposition tell me had the responsibility to advise and prevent the National Assembly from breaking conduct and appointing these board members, was actually a witness in the case, as we mentioned, to prove that alter ego argument.
So it's complicated, but if I have this right from your reporting, actions taken by the far-right coup faction in the Venezuelan opposition have basically helped the process of liquidating one of Venezuela's most valuable assets, Citgo, its oil company in the U.S. So Hernandez testifies in a case that bolsters the case of Crystal X. And then the coup government, after being handed Citgo by the U.S. essentially, they appoint various members of the different boards that control Citgo in a way that also bolsters Crystal X's case. So the end result here is the Venezuelan opposition that's trying to take over Venezuela, they themselves have accelerated the process of liquidating one of Venezuela's most valuable assets.
So what does all of this mean? If Citgo has been liquidated, and again, this court ruling will probably be appealed by various parties, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but Citgo, November 25th or whatever, ruled to be liquidated, sold in a fire sale for whatever, $8 billion, $8 billion, I think it is. ConocoPhillips or ExxonMobil, they'll get the lion's share of this portion. Crystal X maybe will end up with something. We don't know. What does Trump really want? Why is he still saying that Venezuela stole our oil? What does he mean by that? What could he possibly expect Venezuela to give him? Okay. If they've already taken Citgo and they've taken the billions of dollars that Citgo is worth, and the courts have all thus far agreed that the sale can go through and ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips will be reciprocated. It won't cover all of the the expropriated funds that allegedly they're owed. I think ExxonMobil's also owed interest, or maybe it's ConocoPhillips. One of them is owed interest on the expropriated funds or assets. Okay, but it covers most of it. So what does he want if he keeps saying that they stole our oil? Because no, it's actually you who stole Citgo after ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips didn't want to do what every other oil company did. Well, it's extremely corrupt, this whole thing, and it's just an inversion of the history, because the U.S. is the one that stole the oil already. They stole Citgo, and now he's trying to say that that Venezuela somehow like screwed over the U.S. and stole their oil. If Venezuela stole the oil, then why is Chevron still operating there? Venezuela stole the oil. Why did Statoil? Why did Total Oil? Why did all these other oil companies agree to Hugo Chavez's demands, constitutional amendments of 60% state ownership, and they were given fair deals in exchange for whatever percentages that the state needed to reach that 60% threshold? ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, they didn't want to do it, so they can leave. You can't ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips cannot override the constitution of the state of Venezuela. A private Venezuelan company couldn't do that, let alone a foreign transnational. That's kind of the whole reason why they made this constitutional amendment, because they said, wow, we don't want these foreign transnational mega corporations to get so much power that they can run our country under our nose and depose leaders that are not kind to them. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, by refusing to negotiate, proved Hugo Chavez's argument. So the answer as to what Trump wants now, well, one can only assume that Trump wants to, once again, override the Venezuelan constitution and demand that these foreign mega corporations from the United States, from Canada, are allowed to go into Venezuela, rape the economy, rape the resources, steal everything for pennies on the dollar, and have full foreign ownership, at least vast majority foreign ownership of the companies and the projects that are doing this in the process. There will be no state ownership. There will be no state collaboration. There will be no joint projects of any kind. This is going to be the U.S. reaping everything, all of the benefits, all of the rewards. And what are the rewards? The stolen goods of the Venezuelan people below the feet that they are now, their own feet, and the land that they are defending. Okay, so that is what I can assume Trump wants. Venezuela is not going to agree to that, which begs the question, how far is Trump willing to go? We already know he's willing to starve the Venezuelan people. He did that in his first term. We know he's willing to do assassination attempts, right? They did that with the drone attack when John Bolton, Trump, Mike Pompeo, they planned this operation. We know that a lot of people around Trump want to send mercenaries into Venezuela. Eric Prince is a big fan of that. Eric Prince's sister, Betsy DeVos, was Trump's Secretary of Education in his first term. We know that they're willing to prop up fictitious Venezuelan exile governments, which embezzle millions, if not billions of dollars in the process of organizing these humanitarian aid events that are actually meant to serve as the auspices of an invasion into Venezuela, right? Or Citgo. They embezzled tons of money from Citgo. We know they're willing to go and do basically about any extreme in the pursuit of stealing Venezuela's resources and making sure that Venezuela's resources are never exported on anything but the petrodollar in large sums. 80% of Venezuela's oil is currently exported in the petro yuan. Chinese petrodollar. Obviously, Venezuela doesn't do a lot of oil exports because they don't actually get a lot of oil out of the ground. They have a lot of oil in the ground, but they don't get a lot of it out. China could change that, building a lot of processing facilities in the Caribbean. They have the means to export it quite easily. And that's not going to be on the petrodollar. Probably scares the shit out of Trump, and with good reason, I guess. But I think they're willing to go all the way. God forbid, but we will have to wait and see. Before you leave, I want to say thank you for the support, because after
Dr. O from Quebec. Good to have you here. Frank Wood, good to see you. Celestia, good to see you here. And Dave H, as always. Who else is here? American Citizen, good to see you. Sarah Carroll, you made it to class on time. So good to see you, Sarah, as always. Minor Threat, good to see you. 72 Mars, good to see you. And Rapons 01, good to see you as always. I have some housekeeping items for you. Just once again, what I'm going to be addressing in this live stream here. We will be talking about the developments of the support coming from Russia, China. Those are from especially Russia, but now I'm going to detail for you what is China's role, what is Iran's role, and what could North Korea do to add to this really some sort of, I always looked at the role of North Korea as a wild card. That's I've always looked at it. So, as I said before, I'll delve deeper into this, some housekeeping items. Remember to join me. Next week is going to be a very week, believe it or not. I know it's Christmas. Of course, I'm not going to do any interviews or discussions during during Christmas time. But on the 22nd, I will be having my monthly conversation with my two friends, Dr. Warwick Bao and Anna Tangen JD. So he's a doctor also, just in a legal term. So both Einar and Warwick will be here on the 22nd at about, I think, 7:30 p.m. I haven't decided time yet. I'm gonna confirm with them the time, but the date is set for the 22nd. Carl Zaab will be here on the 29th or 27th. I'm sorry. That will be on the 27th, 2 days after Christmas. So that's I just got a confirmation from him yesterday. So, and also I'm gonna have I reached out to author and historian James Bradley, and he responded to me immediately. So he's willing to come in whenever time. So we're gonna set the date and the time, which will be next week, and just go from there. So I look forward to, because you need to know the historical aspect of really this Venezuela conflict, not only in comparison to Vietnam, but James is going to provide us really some insights regarding this. So I look forward to that conversation. So headlines, I have one for you. And this one has to do with an event that took place here in the US. This is a picture of Nuno Loureiro. He's an MIT physics professor. So what happened? He was killed. He was shot in Boston. So, but that's not about him. About that, it is about when the U.S. conducted the investigation, because Israel was saying, "Oh, it's Iran that killed him," and the U.S. conducted the investigation and found out that Iran has nothing to do with it. So the question becomes: will Israel apologize for accusing Iran of assassinating Nuno Loureiro? So the U.S. security investigations have revealed the falsity of the Israeli government's narrative regarding the killing of the MIT nuclear energy professor Nuno Loureiro. So that's his picture once again. After police announced yesterday that they had found the body, or on Thursday, that they have found the body of the they have found the body of the killer who shot himself inside a storage facility, confirming that there were no indications linking the crime to Iran. So the question once again, will Israel come forward and apologize? I don't see that. And by the way, just FYI, who's this guy? Nuno Felipe Gomez Loureiro was a Portuguese, and his specialty in MIT, and I was aware of him to a degree. You kind of have to know, when you work in the government, you have to know who's who. His background is in a plasma physicist. So that's why I was teaching. He's a 43 years old. He was 43 years old. So he was the Herman Feshbach Professor of Physics at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he was the director also of the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center, which he took over from 24 till his death in 2025. So sad ending for the guy and his families. All right, another one, which is a major one, I'm gonna share a clip with you. And this, you remember, I'm gonna be doing more detail for you about what's going on in Europe and link it to what's going on here in the US. But take a look at this video here. I'm gonna share it with you in a screen. This is a Polish politician, Mr. Braun, who tore down the European Union flag, and wiped it with his shoes and burned it. You'll see the image of this. This is what you call a true leader, literally.
W ogóle nie ma czegoś takiego. Nie ma takiego państwa. Chwała Bogu, nie ma jeszcze takiego państwa. Więc nie będziemy w polskim ministerstwie eksponować znaków wrogich nam organizacji, które, chwała Bogu, nie mają statusu państwowego. Tego emblematy nie są otoczone żadną ochroną prawa na terenie Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej. Tu jest Polska, a nie Bruksela.
I'm gonna silence the music here because it's, YouTube doesn't like this one. So we're just gonna look at what he's doing here. There are major demonstrations right now in Europe. So, and I'm gonna be addressing that for you. Well, I'm going to stop right there. So it takes guts to do something like that. So he is one of those. So you admire somebody like that, because what the EU is doing to its people, the European Union was doing to the European people, citizens, it's unbelievable. So, and we have problems here at home, which I'm going to be addressing for you next week. So you need to be aware of that. All right, let's move on into our analysis about what's going on in as an update for Venezuela. As you may know, President Maduro, let me put his picture here for you. Yeah, right here. This is President Maduro, Nicolas Maduro. So what happened? He recently some sort of delivered a televised speech or address, and by which he pushed back and criticized the Trump pressure campaign as a war mongering. And it is. So, because here is what he's saying, which you already know, aiming at seizing Venezuela's natural resources. And this is what Maduro stated, and I quote, he said that the US wants to impose a puppet government. He is right about that, because who are we gonna put there? Assuming we push him out and all that, we're gonna put Machado. You remember her? Well, she's been working with the US for decades. So, and that's what Maduro called the puppet government. So, and that would only last about 47 hours of accusing Washington of seeking to turn Venezuela into a colony. So, and spot on, because Maduro was right. You know, you kind of, when it's right, it's right. You can't sugarcoat it any other way. So Maduro argued that Trump's statements about Venezuela has to do with specific oil, stealing oil from Venezuela and other assets. And that in itself reveals the true motives behind the military buildup. So this is exactly what and Maduro is saying, you know what, we're gonna defend our sovereignty, we're gonna defend our country no matter what. Of course, as you know, this within the context of the US significant military presence after deploying the air and naval forces, including the nuclear-powered submarine, the spy planes, 15,000 troops to the Caribbean, as well as conducting strikes on boats and administrations, end up killing 80 civilians. So, and this leads me to, why am I doing all this for you? Because I'm doing this particular analysis to bring in the two main players, Russia and China. So, and because what Maduro stated was after what the declaration of both countries, the Russia and China. Is this a settled way from this both country as far as support for Maduro? The answer is yes. So, of course, the Russians and the Chinese issued statements criticizing US intervention, you know, and at the same time, some analysts here in Washington are saying that, oh, this remains largely symbolic, no more, no less, rather than concrete, sort of with, for example, Russia providing some advanced systems, China is providing some advanced systems. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. So, because the argument is, well, there is no material assistance despite Maduro requesting military aid, which, by the way, was requested in October. Yeah, it is a foregone conclusion, to my knowledge, that China has no intentions and showing no signs of a military defense of Venezuela. Yeah, they might end up sharing intelligence. They might end up something into that effect. But the idea of why China will go that route is because China doesn't want to jeopardize also the recent diplomatic gains it has with Washington. So to Chinese, they are weighing both sides. And I'm going to detail each one for you, like for the Russians, the Chinese. Then I'll talk about Iran, and I'll talk about North Korea. Well, what's interesting about all this dynamics is that as of Thursday, there were some conversations regarding Nicolas Maduro's conversation with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. But of course, the UN, it's useless. What, are you going to count on the UN to do anything? Look, did the UN did anything about Gaza? Did the UN did anything about the Ansarullah Houthis when the US was bombing? You know, what can the UN do? The UN is almost, in my opinion, I'll put it in the same position as NATO and AU, as irrelevant, as relics. Get rid of NATO, get rid of the AU, and get rid of the UN. And second, why we have it here in New York? Why don't you have it in some neutral country? And that's why there is no neutral country, because you might think Switzerland is a neutral country. It is not. If you only know what the Swiss government is doing behind the scenes in support of the US, there is no neutrality in Switzerland. It's baloney. You know, I never trusted the Swiss government anyway. And that's why it leaves us with the option of, you know, get rid of the UN. Why do you have the UN? Why do you have the UN Security Council? The 5 permanents. Some members inside the 5 permanent members do not want it anymore. So when you have the call that took place between Maduro and the UN Secretary General, the sort of Maduro stressed in this call that Venezuela's oil, natural resources, and a land belong to its people. And he emphasized to Guterres the role that the UN needs to play, because the UN has to categorically reject these American statements, what the US is saying. But again, we know the UN is weak. It's not going to be able to do anything. So, because what this amounts to, literally in modern day, what it amounts to is modern piracy, if I may use the term. So and again, we all know how this is going to go moving forward. And this puts kind of the idea of the consequences for this. And that's what Guterres is saying. Well, Guterres is affirmed his commitment, meaning the UN, to international law and principles of the UN Charter. Okay, what that's going to do to the Venezuelan people? So, because he's also calling for the need to avoid any escalation. What are you going to do about it? So that's why when you have the Secretary General of the UN pledging to follow the situation closely, it doesn't amount to anything. It's because the US already does not have a respect for the UN. Doesn't, if you notice, if there's any time UN peacekeeping forces, when they go anywhere in the world, you never have the US forces under that structure, ever. This is why even for NATO, the commanding officer of NATO is not a European. He will always been, and it will always continue till it dissolved, a 4-star US general. That's just the norm. So what Guterres is saying, it's nothing but a bravado, no more, no less. So, no. And this leads me to talk about really the role of China and Russia that step in to assist Maduro against the US. And again, we're going to have, don't jump quickly to saying, well, they need to send weapons. It does not work that way, unfortunately. So you have to understand, because the situation is more complex. So than just the way you and I looking at it as a straightforward. No, stepping in to assist, it's very, it has to be a calculated move. So of course, both countries, Russia and China, have issued vocal support, but the actual military and economic assistance is going to be very limited to a degree. So China has been now voicing even vociferously, loudly, that is. So let's look at the Russia's position. So Maduro requested help from the Russian directly through a letter that was sent to President Putin. And it's basically Maduro asking for directly, I need missiles, I need radar repairs, and I need assistance restoring Russian fighter jets. So that was straightforward. So, but at the same time, Maduro had to take into consideration what Russia is significantly facing vis-a-vis the constraints regarding its ongoing war with the Ukraine. So you look at also Russia with the economic pressure it's under, even though its economy is moving forward, it's operating. And this is why making this aid, substantial aid, in my opinion, will be unlikely. Where I see it moving forward is that Russia could provide some military assistance through a third party. And this is what happened when Maduro, you remember last August, Maduro visited Russia. So, because what happened? He left Russia without new loans from Russia or bilateral trade at the same time, even though trade between Russia and Venezuela reached about $1.2 billion back in 2024, to my knowledge. So, and within this context, you're going to look at how Russia expressing its support for Maduro approach, and that's what you notice in the changes in the language. Here is what the Russians are saying, and I quote, to protect Venezuela's interests and sovereignty. So the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs also noticed stating, and I quote, continuous and deliberate escalations by the Americans. And of course, this language suggests that the possibility for Russia to step in is there. It just might not be the right time right now. And what led me to this conclusion? One particular action by the Russians, and that action is that the Russians ratified a strategic partnership treaty with Venezuela and stated that it will help Venezuela, and here is the key word, overcome any threats. Read between the lines. Russians are very shrewd. They understand how the global dynamics operates. They're not going to come openly like this and say, we're going to send missiles. No. Doesn't work that way. So, of course, to the Russians, they decide to keep the actual scope of assistance very, very ambiguous and unclear. Because Washington will not know what kind of assistance are we talking about here. And this is why, as of today, Russia continues to make military diplomacy through limited exchanges and some sort of equipment deliveries. There are deliveries out there. So, like, for example, I was aware of one delivery of the opening of an ammunition factory, which opened in July. Of course, a military transport aircraft landed in Caracas. So it's just, we're going to see it differently. From China's perspective, China's foreign ministry reaffirmed Beijing's backing of Venezuela. Of course, China has an interest, strategic interest, in ensuring the stability of Venezuela so it can have access to energy, oil, that is. But this appears largely some sort of rhetorical, if I may use the term. So, because most of the reporting and that I had a chance to read indicated, in my opinion, that China is kind of doesn't want to jeopardize these recent diplomatic gains with Washington, because it will work to its benefit. Because China is looking already for next year, how it's going to be vis-a-vis the relations with the US. We're already looking at what the US is doing in South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. You look at what Japan is doing. You look at now North Korea in itself threatening the Americans for deploying an aircraft carrier for some joint exercises with South Korea. So to the Chinese, they're going to have to be thinking strategically. That's why they're going to be very, very particular about how they're going to word this specific. That's why they're not going to take aggressive steps in defending Maduro militarily, so to speak. So, because when you look at the language of the Chinese statements, for example, China condemned all unilateral actions as bullying moves. Once again, read between the lines. And this particular, we all know who the message is intended for. This is regarding Trump's pressure on Venezuela. So, and that's what the Chinese Foreign Ministry declared. So, that all countries in defending support, that China supports all countries in defending their sovereignty and dignity. That's also a subtle message from China to the rest of the world regarding Taiwan. You know, China's hitting two birds with one stone. We're going to send a message regarding our support for Venezuela, but also going to make it clear for the rest of the world that this defense of sovereignty that all countries are entitled to, that applies also for us vis-a-vis Taiwan. And this is why the Chinese Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi, argued, and I remember him stating this one, and I'm just paraphrasing here, as just if I forget a word or two, that'd be okay. But when he argued at the time that a mutual trust and support are tradition in bilateral relations between Venezuela and China. So he also added, and this what took me by surprise at that time during his statement, is that China and Venezuela are strategic partners. You remember what I said yesterday about Mexico, how it's shooting itself in the foot because Latin America is moving in the strategic direction with Asia headed by China, while Mexico is following the US. So, and this is exactly what Mr. Wang Yi, once again, is a subtle message that is sending to the Americans, but also for the US. Now, this leads me to talk about the role of Iran. So, of course, you don't hear much about this one here. But Iran is already involved in sending hardware. So here is what happened. Iran and Venezuela coordinated the delivery of military equipment and drones from Iran. So, and as a matter of fact, Venezuela requested from Iran long-range drones of about 1,000 kilometers. They also added one other demand on the list, and that was GPS jamming devices. Now, one thing I do not know for a fact is the exact types of drones. However, doing my own research, I got an idea, and I'm going to share pictures with you. If anybody knows the exact type of the drones delivered to Venezuela from Iran, please share it with the community. So, and this is why Iran sort of provides certain tangible assistance, but the scale of it, to what level, is unclear. Of course, it has to be that way. So, and this is where you look at now all three countries, Iran, China, and Russia, all in coordination, supporting Venezuela, opposing the United States intervention. So, of course, as an analyst, I will always be putting that big question mark regarding their, meaning China, Russia, Iran, their actual military support, whether it is modest or not. So, because as of now, based on what we know, the declaration of solidarity is there rather than a coordinated defense strategy. So I'm going to share some pictures with you regarding some drones that I am aware of. So this is, you're looking at the this one here. It's by the IRGC. That's the 2023, which was developed, which was released to the public knowledge as well. The IRGC, Aerospace Force Coordination. That's one of their particular drones. The other one that I am aware of, it has to do with this Iranian Shahed drones. So the one that I am really surprised about is this one right here. Now this one, this is the new Hadid 110 stealth suicide drones, and this was from imagery that was picked up by the Israelis. This is once again why the Israelis have to think now twice about really attacking Iran again. The other one that I am aware of, it was, I think, the Shahed 121, if I am not mistaken. Yeah. And by the way, those ones you're looking at right here, okay, this is the Shimor, which is a Persian word derived from Middle Persians. So, which was, if you know the history a little bit, it was a benevolent bird in the Persian mythology. So, and it's designed, by the way, it's designed, the Shimor is called Shimor, is a reverse engineer of the US RQ-170. The only difference with this one here is that it has multiple unknown variants, and one of which has been modified now to play a role of the UCAV, which is usually armed with 4 missiles. This is again where I am seeing where the difference here regarding the designs that Iran, which one, and this is the one, the Shahed 171. This is the advanced ones too. And I don't know, you know, I don't know conclusively what type of drones Iran provided Venezuela. All I know is that it was some deliveries. So that's what I'm saying. For our community, if there is anyone who is 100% sure of what type of drones, please share it with the community, because that's what we want to do here. Because all those You know, of course, for something like this, more advanced, what are the likelihood that Iran will send this one?
Good deal, man.
I don't know. It's hard because there is no confirmation to this. So I don't want to speculate with stuff like this. You can speculate. If you know it, you state it. If you don't. You can just, you know, it can be stated, but said, you know what, not confirmed, to make sure. But to my knowledge, the Iranians are operating this particular type of drones. They are. So which one they were sent to Venezuela, I cannot confirm that. Liking this video so far? Don't just be a watcher. Go ahead and hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And don't forget to tap the bell so you will not miss any of my videos or live streams. This way, you will be supporting a channel that stands for the truth and objective reporting. Message to that. So the announcements, in my opinion, are significant in several ways. So, of course, there will be those critics who are going to say, well, wait a minute, Dr. O, the actual military impact is limited. I am not denying that. Yeah, I'm not denying it. But at the same time, I am not concluding that it will never be. So at least for the message that's being sent is that now the joint backing from China, Iran, and Russia sends that clear geopolitical signal. Once again, guys, always please see the big picture. The geopolitical signal that the message is, it has to do with that, with sort of the indication that the United States doesn't have a complete free hands in the Western Hemisphere as it once did. Because look at it, the Russians' ratification of the Strategic Partnership Treaty with Venezuela, the statements that it will help Venezuela overcome any threats. This, in my opinion, represents a formal sort of escalation commitment on part of the Russians. Even if we are to say, well, even if the concrete backing remain some sort of limited or modest. Yeah, I know this. But at the same time, this demonstrates these powers are willing, meaning Russia, China, Iran, are willing to challenge what has been historically considered as America's regional sphere of influence, which was at some point in history. We're not going to deny this. You know, you all know about the Monroe Doctrine, you know, but it's dead, in my opinion, even though some in Washington saying, oh, it's still well, live and well. So there is also what these announcements, the message also sending, it signals to the US that the US, you know, those who will challenge it. So particularly those facing American pressure, that backing exists from other major powers. It is partly, in my opinion, a deterrent message. So the US isn't acting unopposed. This is why, you know what's going on, which next week I will do for you an analysis about the Europeans, what's going on. There's a conversation right now in Europe about, is it time to start looking for another security umbrella? Of course, are you going to trust what the Europeans saying? But at the same time, the fact that they are voicing this says a lot. And this is why when I have a conversation with author and historian James Bradley, we're going to be addressing the dimensions of this aspect, not only comparing to Vietnam, which I will talk about briefly here, because I want to have James deals with detail all this, since he's a historian, so he will have a much sort of better understanding, historically speaking, addressing this. And this is part of where that importance of understanding where these dynamics are moving. Okay, now comes the big elephant in a room. I always call it the wild card, North Korea. To those who have, I don't know, about 2 years ago, yeah, 2 years ago, I did a video about North Korea in supporting Burkina Faso. I'm going to put a link for you in the chat box. I highly urge you to take a look at this video. So I'm going to put it in the chat box for you right there. So, and I think that video had about almost over 200,000 views, because everybody was like, what are you talking about, Dr. O? Of course, they didn't expect it because nobody saw it coming. And I argued about the unexpected ally. That's what I'm seeing happening here. So now let's talk about North Korea, because its role is not going to be as you may expect. North Korea is going to send its missiles. No. Doesn't work that way. Because in my assessment, North Korea is unlikely to directly provide some sort of advanced military hardware or missiles to Venezuela. Of course, like China, like Russia, like Iran, even Iran went ahead with the delivery of drones. It expressed its vocal support. So why? Because you have to understand the historical ties between the two countries, Venezuela and North Korea. You also have to understand the current stance of North Korea vis-a-vis the conflict, what's going on. So North Korea and Venezuela, of course, established. Does anybody, this question for you, just trivia question. Does anybody know what year did Venezuela and North Korea establish diplomatic relations? So let me just see in the chat box if you happen to know. So, and once again, we're just learning from each other here. No more, no less. Let me see if anybody can guess it. If you happen to know. I know there's a delay here. It doesn't show up on time here. So, okay, it's not coming up here. I gotta move on. Kulkaman, 1980. No, before that. It was before that. I'll do one more. The question was, what year did North Korea and Venezuela establish diplomatic relations? It was one specific year. That was the question. Carmo, 1972. No, before that. Think about the era of Vietnam War. So, okay, let's move on. 1965, crucial year. Think about it. So since that time, the relationship between the two countries have gradually improved, especially under the late Hugo Chavez, and of course the current one, Nicolas Maduro. So what happened? Because both countries share a common enemy. And who is the enemy? The United States. They are critical of that. And what happened in 2013? In 2013, North Korean ambassador warned that if the United States government dared to engage in a military attack on Venezuela, North Korea will assist Venezuela. And the two parties, meaning North Korea and Venezuela, at that time, created a friendship group of Venezuela with the Democratic People's Republic of K, or DPRK. My point is that there is the underlying, the silver underlying into these statements by North Korea. So, except you're not going to see it openly. And there is other reason for that, of what North Korea now is dealing with, which I will get into in a point here. So the recent support from North Korea recognized Maduro's victory during the elections in 2024. Remember, there were disputed presidential elections. North Korea was the first, in addition to the Chinese, I think, and the Russians. I don't know about Iran, whether they did or not, but I'm sure they have done. And in August of this year, 2025, through November, reports mentioning Venezuela, sort of, and the Caribbean in North Korea's top newspapers, meaning they were mentioned in their kind of the bilateral relations and so forth. So, and this is where you have to think in terms, why is this important? So, of course, I'm not denying there are practical limitations. But like the same arguments I made when I made the video about the unexpected ally of Burkina Faso which was North Korea. When I did that video back then, that was the same arguments I made. Nobody saw it. I'm seeing the same pattern here. So of course there are the practical limitations. So of course, North Korea is not going to replace China's monetary role in supporting Venezuela, because North Korea's economy is not comparable to that of China. It's common sense. What North Korea can do when it makes the decision, it can provide Venezuela with advanced military technology because North Korea has it. So, and that knowledge in itself will be sufficient enough for Venezuela to really stand on its feet, militarily speaking. So, but still, even with that, the North Korean support to Venezuela will remain limited in comparison to that of either Russia, China, Iran. So, but especially Russia and China. So the broader context of this, so when we think the big picture, and like I said earlier, you're going to have to think in terms of what North Korea is dealing with right now. North Korea's defense minister, his name is No Kwang-cho. My apologies if I mispronounced. So what's important about the defense minister is that he has condemned the arrival of the United States aircraft carrier at a port in South Korea. And North Korea issued a warning that Pyongyang will take more offensive action against its enemies. So this is what's important to understand as to how far North Korea is going to go vis-a-vis supporting Venezuela, because there are also issues next door and it needs to take care of that. Why? Because North Korea never ever trusted the South Koreans or the American presence there or the Japanese for that matter. So this is what the big picture that I need you to understand. And within this, to have a better understanding, and I'm going to conclude with this, why it matters, despite the military, limited military aid, why this matters. When you look at these four countries, Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea, why it matters. Because in geopolitics, of course, the military dimensions of it play a major role, but also you cannot ignore the diplomatic, how symbolic that can be. It's because sometimes the diplomatic dimension or the diplomatic venture weigh in more than you can even imagine. Because the weight of these diplomatic initiatives is considerable when it comes down to assessing the big picture geopolitically speaking. So even though Russia, for example, faces significant constraint due to its the war that's going on with Ukraine and so forth. So substantial aid, unlikely, militarily speaking. So, but the public commitment, that's the key word, still carries weight. So it tells Maduro, it tells the Venezuelan people that the Maduro government, it's not diplomatically isolated, but also will complicate matters for the US action by raising the potential for international escalation. So for the limitations, no matter how you look at it, so the message has a real limit. I am not denying this. So you look at also about China's role. While it might appear reluctant to risk its diplomatic game, so it's Chinese are thinking strategically for this. So Iran assistance is in a different angle. So when you look at that triangle, Russia, Iran, China, or China, Russia, Iran, or what have you. So when you look at the big picture of this, is modest in scope. We understand that. But the announcement in itself is more about positioning and deterrence than a coordinated military intervention, as I mentioned earlier. And this leads me to the final question here, which I will address in detail with James Bradley when he's here next week, but I am going to just briefly touch on it. If the US invade Venezuela, will Venezuela become another Vietnam? Of course, it is a complex question. The compatibility is even, while it might be there, but it's different, because that will depend on several factors. So what I'm going to be sharing with you just the basics, because I don't want to take this away from James Bradley, because I want to talk to him about this one. One thing that I know for a fact is it will be a nightmare, a quagmire for the US. So, because the comparison to Vietnam, to me, in my opinion, is important. Of course, there are differences, you know, the timing and what have you. So, even when you ask military experts, because they view in now largely the US invasion is unlikely. But if it happened, hypothetically here, the parallels to past, you know, quagmire of Vietnam are sort of striking. So, and this is why it could become, invading Venezuela could become another Vietnam. As a matter of fact, Maduro himself said to Trump, you do not want another Vietnam here. So the core issue is that Venezuela's military doctrine, which, by the way, this morning, to my knowledge, military in Venezuela have been put on the highest alert. The fighters, the fighter jets, and everybody in the military is on the high alert. That tells me they are ready. So, but when you look at Venezuela's military doctrine, it has been designed to create potential political and a military quagmire by using their own geography, by using space for time, and at the same time turning the geography of Venezuela, that means the city, the jungles, and what have you, into some sort of prolonged guerrilla warfare, like exactly what we had in Iraq. You all remember Fallujah, right? Couldn't defeat those groups. We had the same in Afghanistan, same in Somalia. So, and this is what the doctrine in Venezuelan military, to those who aren't familiar with it, it has this particular capacity and ability to turn an invasion like that into a prolonged guerrilla battleground. So, and that will make the politically unsustainable control of the country. So Venezuela's strategy, which is known, by the way, to those who are familiar, as I said again, with the doctrine in Spanish, it is called Guerra del Todo del Pueblo, People's War. Guerra de Todo el Pueblo, People's War. And why is this came into the doctrine of Venezuela? Because it was inspired by the Vietnamese tactics. And that in itself aims at blurring the boundaries between society and the battlefield by relying on population participation in prolonged resistance. So the practical challenges for the US are substantial. And I'm talking to you based on experience. I'm talking based on what I've seen on the field, on the ground, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Iraq, in parts of Africa. Venezuela is roughly twice the size of Iraq. It has mountains, it has jungles, and it has a densely populated urban areas. So even if I am to go with this scenario that the US could capture Caracas, controlling the entire country will be a huge undertaking. American forces will be quickly achieve the air dominance. Okay? They will also be able to sort of shred the conventional forces of Venezuela. But air power itself cannot control or compel an overall control of a country this large. Look what happened in Afghanistan with all the mighty air power we had. Did we defeat the Taliban? So because what Venezuela did in this doctrine is to ensure that this sort of, if there's an invasion, it will be faced with fractured country. You can't control it in its entirety. So the real war, in my opinion, will begin only after the skies are quiet. And this is something I do not know if Mr. Trump understands or not. And I didn't even talk about the insurgency problem or challenge yet, because we faced them in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Yemen. And we couldn't defeat them. So resistance will include pro-Maduro militias, which are called collectivos, those who are familiar. And this, you're looking at over 1,000. Yeah, you might think 1,000 is nothing. A hardened Colombian guerrilla based in Venezuela. You look at also civilians who are trained and armed by the government. So even though you think about what the US military technology is superior, yes, it is. Yeah, urban, in my experience, urban warfare in the dense cities will nullify some of these advantages the US has. And frankly, to be frank with you, any invasion would likely turn segments of the population that oppose Maduro against the US. Why? Because they're all gonna unite around national sovereignty. This is what we have failed to understand in Afghanistan and Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, or even Vietnam back then. So, and the last thing will be the international complications to something like this. So, as a matter of fact, it was a memo inside the US National Security Council, the NSC. So, and that in itself, I think it gets declassified because I had a chance to look at it. But it was, what's the word? It wasn't classified, it was sensitive use only. It described at that time the scenario, and I put it in quotes because I have to keep it for you too, so you know. Quagmire that would become a cause célèbre for criminal or illegal armed groups in the Americas. And that in itself, by the way, will draw in jihadist-style fighters against US forces. So the bottom line, the big picture of all this, and I'm going to end with this, experts, military, analysts, foreign affairs, geopolitical, or what have you, even academia, and even ideological ones from all spectrums, all of them agreed that this will be a protracted, costly, and politically difficult undertaking to sustain. Particularly when you consider a recent poll in the United States showed 70% of the American people oppose military action in Venezuela. So yeah, Vietnam style, Quagmire is the concern that as an analyst I will voice. Though it is important to note one particular thing, that a full invasion remain widely considered unlikely rather than imminent. What do you think? Make sure to leave me a comment in the comment section. I would greatly appreciate it.
That don't like Maduro, about 20% of the population, with their help trying to stage a coup that could then bring in Mrs. Machado as the preferred puppet in Caracas. The question is, what good is it? How does it help us? How do we benefit strategically? I don't think we do. I think that we run the risk of mobilizing millions of people in Latin America against us. How many times have we tried to pull this coup off in the past? It's failed and it's failed and it's failed. I've always been concerned that this becomes a bottomless pit for U.S. resources, not just military, but period, at a point in time where we're on the edge of bankruptcy.
This is Colonel Douglas McGregor, the former advisor to the Secretary of Defense and one of the best insiders into the U.S. military and foreign policy around the world. Right now, the United States is moving dangerously close to its next major military conflict. Take a look at this map, which details the exact locations of the U.S. government's military strikes against Venezuela. At the time of this recording, the U.S. military has conducted 26 strikes, killing at least 99 people. But here's the problem. Many of the victims are innocent fishermen caught in the middle of a violent U.S. military buildup as the United States prepares for its next big move. Earlier this week, Trump sent this message outlining exactly what the U.S. government is planning to do. Venezuela is completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. It will only get bigger, and the shock to them will be nothing they have ever seen before. Today, I am ordering a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela. Which is interesting, because I guess Venezuela being in charge of its own oil wealth is considered a form of theft by the U.S. ruling class. Just listen to Trump's own words accusing Venezuela of stealing from the United States.
Just a blockade. Not going to let anybody going through that shouldn't be going through. You remember they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil from not that long ago, and we want it back. But they took it. They illegally took it.
Now, as you can imagine, this caused an uproar in Venezuela, with President Maduro immediately firing back at Trump with a fiery speech and warning to the U.S. government.
Cuando el gobierno de los Estados Unidos dice y que los venezolanos le robamos el petróleo, o sea, que el petróleo venezolano le pertenece a ellos, que los minerales venezolanos, el oro y todos los minerales le pertenecen a ellos. Y lo que nunca habíamos escuchado, que las tierras de Venezuela le pertenecen a ellos y se lo tenemos que devolver de manera inmediata. Es una pretensión guerrerista y colonialista. Y toda la riqueza y convierta a Venezuela en una colonia. Sencillamente eso no va a pasar. Nunca, jamás. Never, never in the life. Venezuela será colonia. De nada, de nadie.
But support from other countries in Latin America is strong. Just listen to the president of Mexico address this escalating crisis and explain the exact position of Mexico.
La situación en Venezuela, reiteramos la posición de México, acorde con la Constitución, de no intervención, no injerencia extranjera, autodeterminación de los pueblos y solución pacífica de las controversias. Llamamos a que cualquier controversia internacional se utilice el diálogo y la paz y no a la intervención. Esa es nuestra posición por convicción.
The last thing the world needs is another military conflict led by the U.S. government. And in today's video, I sit down with Colonel Douglas McGregor to discuss why Venezuela is a solvable diplomatic challenge, why U.S. sanctions have failed, and why the actions of the U.S. government are already considered an act of war by international law. If you want to understand everything about the Venezuela conflict, this is the interview for you. Let's begin.
Well, Colonel, this is the perfect transition to the next topic, and it's going to be a conflict that a lot of people are talking about right now. That's, of course, Venezuela. I want to shift our gears here to Venezuela because this is becoming very, very concerning, I think, for the United States, certainly for U.S. citizens like ourselves who are looking at this next potential conflict. You recently shared a post on X which states that Venezuela is a solvable diplomatic challenge, not a war that America needs or can afford. I want to know, from a realistic military perspective, what makes Venezuela diplomatically solvable, and why would a war be such a strategic mistake for the United States?
Well, let's take the first question. Remember that Mr. Maduro offered enormous stakes to President Trump in the oil and gas industries, which are the primary but not the only interest in Venezuela. In other words, we could come back into the country as we once were with our oil companies and expertise. And we have the best deep drilling oil engineers in the world. We have the best technology, and we're ideally suited to do that. Plus the fact the distance from Venezuela to the United States in terms of moving the the heavy oil with the high sulfur content that has to be refined in the United States is very short. We built refineries years ago in the United States that were ideally suited to convert Venezuela's heavy oil into fuel. So we're sitting there ready to go, and this can be done. But President Trump sees this as the opportunity to drive Russia and China permanently out of the Western Hemisphere by making it impossible for them to stay in Venezuela. Well, I'm not sure that's what's going to happen. First of all, the Chinese have been there before, and they frankly gave up on Chavez and left because Chavez didn't pay back the loans that he owed to the Chinese. The Chinese, and we've discussed this before, they're all about business. I mean, they'll give you a lot of rope and they'll go a long way with you. But if you finally default and say, forget it, I don't have anything, they'll pack their stuff and leave. The Russian interest in Venezuela is a little different because they have an interest in more than just oil. Remember, they also have this distant connection with Cuba, and they have tried to help the Cuban government, not because they're communists, but because of this long-standing relationship that emerged with Cuba over many, many decades. And so they've tried to help stabilize the country to the extent that they could, in return for which they have been handsomely rewarded with gold. And the gold has been loaded by the ton on aircraft and flown straight into Moscow. So the Russians have also said, we'll provide you with whatever we can in terms of air and missile defense, radars, some strike weapons, and so forth. But I don't think the Russians or the Chinese are interested in going to war with us over Venezuela. So the real question is, militarily, what can we do with Venezuela? We can bomb it. Will we lose some aircraft? Maybe. It's hard to tell. Can we land troops there? Yes. It depends on how we go in and under what circumstances. I think we're trying to stage a coup. We're trying, with the help of CIA mercenaries and agents, along with domestic malcontents, people that don't like Maduro, about 20% of the population, with their help, trying to stage a coup that could then bring in Mrs. Machado as the preferred puppet in Caracas. That's a slender straw from which to suspend all of this. How many times have we tried to pull this coup off in the past? It's failed and it's failed and it's failed. But we have the same people like Elliot Abrams, Marco Rubio, and others who've always been interested in going down there and toppling the government. Now, if that works, then the thousands of troops that are sitting in Puerto Rico are really designed to be a stabilization force, to come in and help stabilize the society. Well, I don't know how that works. Good luck with that, because they're not going to become welcome members of Venezuelan society if they go down there, because most of the population isn't going to like it. And then you have, of course, the firepower, and we've got enough firepower that we could probably level Caracas if we wanted to. The question is, what good is it? How does it help us? How do we benefit strategically? I don't think we do. I think that we run the risk of mobilizing millions of people in Latin America against us. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Colombia and Brazil, paramilitary formations that would love to cross the border, come in and help people in Venezuela fight us. In other words, I've always been concerned that this becomes a bottomless pit for U.S. resources, not just military, but period, at a point in time where we're on the edge of bankruptcy. Why would you do such a thing? Well, I don't know. This seems like it's become a kind of vanity project. I think President Trump has talked himself into a corner. So the answer to the second question is, I see no strategic benefit to us at all. In the long term, it'll be disastrous. But, there's a lot of disinformation. I tell everybody to go to the Drug Enforcement Agency's website, read what's there. And Venezuela is not a big player in the drug business. Their piece of it is maybe 4%, which is almost nothing. Now, the second thing is that, yes, I agree with the president. These illegal migrants that came into the United States, many of these Venezuelan gangs are horrible, should be dealt with harshly. Sure, I agree with all that. But we have to remember it was Biden that suspended the rule of law, who opened our borders, who stood down the police and the military and said, by all means, come in. So let's solve that problem at home. You're not going to solve that problem by destroying Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And Carl, you touched on a really good point, was the sanctions. And I want to say, we've had multiple rounds of sanctions against Venezuela, multiple, coup attempts, even mercenary operations, but Maduro is still in power. And simultaneously, we've seen Venezuela move closer to Russia, China, Iran. At what point does this become clear evidence that U.S. sanctions and its regime change doctrine are just strategically broken.
I think we have voluminous evidence to support that assertion. The problem is it doesn't seem to matter to the people in Washington, and that's our sticking point here. You know, it's like if you ask the average American, what do you think about NATO? In Kansas City, they're probably going to say, well, what's NATO? If you go to Seattle, Washington, they say, well, what's the problem in this place called NATO? Where's that city located? In other words, an awful lot happens in the absence of understanding because most Americans are not engaged. Now we have a Congress, which is probably, as Lou Dobbs used to say, the best government money can buy. And what are they doing about any of this? Where is the invocation of the War Powers Act? It's non-existent. Who's demanding a declaration of war? Tucker Carlson announced earlier today that a member of Congress told him that President Trump would speak to the nation tonight and announce that we're going to war with Venezuela. Well, the last time I looked, Congress has to declare war. The president has to go and ask for the declaration. Well, we've had plenty of presidents that circumvented the law, but in most cases, they recognized it, disguised it, and tried to recover from it. There's no even remote interest in the law at all with President Trump. He's decided, I'm the president, I can do any damn thing I want. And thanks to his donors who seem to own everybody in Washington, I guess he can.
Well, I think you hit on a good point there because, you know, you mentioned earlier before, you know, we about the drugs, right? And we've seen that the United States has labeled this, they're calling these strikes on these Venezuelan fishing boats, it's a drug interdiction. You know, basically we need to stop these drug lords. But like you said, the data shows us that Venezuela is not a major player. It's actually a very, very small player, like you pointed out. And, you know, we've now surrounded Venezuela with warships. And, you know, have we already, you know, moved past you know, has this basically been clear evidence that we're now, in fact, already started a war? I mean, have we gone past law enforcement, and is this already Trump declaring a war?
Yes. I think we have to recognize that we are effectively in a state of war with Venezuela. You can't announce a blockade of a country from the sea without being at war. It's by definition, under international law, that puts you at war. So I think effectively we are. That's why I said, where's Congress? Congress is absent. It's a fugitive from accountability. Congress isn't going to do anything until they see evidence for problems and failure. Then they'll all come out of the woodwork and say, see, we never really supported this. The president's made a terrible mistake. We think he should be impeached. I mean, that's kind of where we are now. It's ridiculous. They have a duty, frankly, to stand up and be counted on this matter and put an end to it. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last point. There's something else happening here that people need to be aware of. Somebody tried to convince me recently, well, the Iranians have terrorist training camps in Venezuela. Well, that's just nonsense. That's not true. The Iranians are friendly to Venezuela. Well, that may be true. The Venezuelans have an interest in them because they too are another oil power. All of the oil powers have an interest in each other because they're part of a larger market. They have a huge impact on the planet. But we have to understand that now Mr. Netanyahu has mentioned Venezuela, and suddenly Venezuela is now anti-Semitic because it has recognized the legitimacy of the Palestinians and the state they want to build. That makes them anti-Semites. Therefore, they all deserve to die. So you have a number of converging forces here, and many billionaires are happy to do whatever they can to bring down anybody and anyone anywhere who doesn't immediately, unconditionally support Israel. Right. So that's in the background of this thing, sadly. That doesn't help matters either, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a tough one with Netanyahu because we saw, you know, with that unfortunate terrorist attack in Australia, for example, right? Netanyahu came out and specifically said, oh, look, Australia has shifted to an anti-Semitic narrative, you know, simply because they wanted to, you know, recognize the state of Palestine. And of course, now Netanyahu is saying, look, this is what happens when you get that. So it's an unfortunate use of a tragedy to then support his agenda. Not surprising from Netanyahu. I mean, we've seen that track record for him. But
yeah, but Cyrus, if President Netanyahu cared as deeply as he says he does about Jews in Australia, then you would meet privately with the prime minister or send your representative there, and you would say, "This is horrible. We want to help you prevent this from ever having to go through this again. Tell us what we can do so we can help you prevent this kind of thing in the future." You don't go out of your way to alienate the government of Australia and the people of Australia by effectively saying you're anti-Semites. That's a lot of nonsense. You know, so the only thing that he has done and I've been watching this for months, this man has cultivated anti-Semitism on a scale that I don't think we've seen for 100 years. Right. It's insane. He's making it worse than I think it's ever been. And you would think someone would go to him and say, look, you may be well-intentioned, but this is not working. This is going to make it worse.
Oh, I couldn't agree more on that. And Colonel, I want to kind of talk a little bit about Venezuela, because I do think that let's just say that we do move forward with a military intervention or maybe a coup government operation, something that really amplifies this even more. I think that the United States is very stretched right now, right? We still are obviously dealing with Ukraine. We are looking at, if we are deciding to go into Venezuela, and officially, I mean, I know you've said that we're basically at war right now because we've blockaded them on the seas. But if we continue to move forward this, I think this is going to be a lot more complex than in Libya or in Iraq, where, effectively we're able to do this coup government. I think Venezuela is much more complex than that. Is this going to stretch the United States military even more thin? And could this lead to even more problems with other conflicts around the world?
Absolutely. And not only are we going to alienate a large portion of the states in the world, about which we normally don't care, unfortunately, we're going to make life for us miserable. You can't put thousands of American soldiers on the ground in a country like that and expect them to go in, stabilize it, and make it work. First of all, you would need hundreds of thousands of troops for that. We've only got 15, 16, 17,000 to send in. The good news is that we do have a lot of people that can speak Spanish. That's helpful. But even under the best of circumstances, dealing with all the problems on the ground in that country between the various political entities and actors, the various classes, the abject poverty, we're going to make that worse. Because inevitably, if we go in there and we assume any kind of responsibility for it, we're going to have to import vast quantities of food and medical support. The place is not in great shape. So again, you always have to ask yourself, is there a way to do this and work through the existing government, however much you may not like it? Or do we absolutely positively have to attack this place, destroy the government, and then ultimately make ourselves responsible for it? I think the first option is better. Whatever you don't like about Maduro and his regime, and you know how we do business, we suddenly demonize everybody in sight. Well, this man, Juan Guaido, he continues to run around the country and speak. Mrs. Machado has done that. They haven't been arrested, imprisoned, or shot. In other words, we call this regime a communist regime. We accuse it of totalitarian trappings or whatever. Is it that bad? I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but is it so bad that we absolutely have to perform surgery with the American military? Because we know what that kind of surgery does. It's not precise. It never is. It can't be. And the other thing is, there's no real strong support inside the United States for this. It's all very superficial. Something goes wrong, and what happens? I always go back to the example of sending the Marines to Lebanon back in 81, 82 under Reagan. And this all happened without consulting, believe it or not, Cap Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense. It happened because George Shultz went to President Reagan and said, I think we should do this. We have an obligation, a moral obligation to go into Lebanon. We have to do this to help the people there. It's also important for stability for the Israelis, all this kind of nonsense. So what happened? Cap Weinberger didn't want anything to do with it, told Ronald Reagan, forget it. We're not going to make a dent. It's impossible. Stay out. We went in. We had, 340 Marines killed in an instant, thanks to a bomb. And what was the reaction? Well, I can tell you what Reagan said after that was over. He told Cap Weinberger, Cap, you were right. I was wrong. We're going to get our men out of there now. And we got out. Remember, there were all sorts of speeches. We'll hunt down these people and punish them and everything else. But it was a realization we had no business being there. So my question is, what happens if you get a large casualty event in Venezuela? What happens if Marines flying ashore in helicopters landing at the international airport are blown out of the sky? What happens if you put a couple of thousand troops on the ground, move them around the country, and you get 200 or 300 people killed? If that happens, the American people wake up. And somebody says, what are we doing? I mean, I noticed recently, Cyrus, I'm sure you did, 2 Army National Guardsmen were killed over in Syria. Now, everybody said, what? What are they doing there? Well, I can tell you what they're doing there because I tried on behalf of President Trump in 2020 to get us out. And I was told they had to be there for Israel, not us, for Israel. Now, the Guard is part of the problem because the Army National Guard is happy to pitch in because they see themselves as competing with the regular army. Behind the scenes, the National Guard always derides the army, wants to replace it, and argues we're cheaper. You know, we're citizen soldiers. Disaster. These people had no business being there. The people of Iowa don't like it. They want answers. That's for 2. Let's take that number and multiply it and make it 200. And I think that's where we're headed, potentially in Venezuela.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. The fact that American citizens certainly don't want to have another conflict. I think Donald Trump campaigns that he's the peace president, and I think this would be an absolute disaster for him if he were to continue moving forward. But of course, we're going to have to keep our eyes on this, because it is every single day evolving into something much more complex. But Colonel, I want to kind of the last question here. I think you and I were chatting before the show started a little bit about China. And talking about that, of course, a big narrative in Washington, for example, is we need to tackle Russia and Venezuela because they're assets with China, and we're getting ready for the next conflict is going to be with China. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on China and how it pertains to the U.S. foreign policy. And I know that a lot of people are thinking that China wants to start a war with the United States. Let us know your answer to that.
Well, here's a couple of things. First of all, it seems as though Americans are treated to one of 2 diets. Diet number 1 comes from somebody like Gordon Chang or Peter Zeihan. Oh, China's on the verge of collapse. It's going to fall apart. The end of China is near. Okay, that's nonsense. Forget it. Throw it out. China's not going to collapse. 2, China is arming to the teeth. It's going to be the greatest military power in the world because it's already overtaking the United States in economic power. It wants to dominate Asia. It wants to dominate the world. Okay, that's wrong. Is China going to overtake us economically? Well, in terms of purchasing power for the yuan, it already has.
Right.
Is that a threat to us? I don't think so. Most of the problems we have financially were manufactured here in the United States, not in China. So I would dismiss that out of hand. Do the Chinese want to replace us with the reserve currency, making it the yuan? I can tell you absolutely not. In fact, they would prefer that we remain the reserve currency. The problem is that's not going to happen because the reserve currency, as Nassim Taleb says, is really gold now. And the Chinese buying up as much of it as possible, as are the Russians, the Indians, everybody else, because they see where this economy is going in the United States. We're headed down, 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 and I don't see President Trump arresting that anytime soon. But the notion that China strives to be this global military power is absurd. There's no evidence for that. And the people that make these arguments know nothing about the Chinese. They've never been to China. They don't know anything about Chinese history and culture. And they sort of equate today's China with the rising power of Imperial Japan, and that they're somehow or another on the same path that are going to behave like the Japanese. Well, I can tell you something. If you know anything about the Chinese and talk to them, frankly, they remain more afraid today of Japan than they are of us. And the only way that you can appreciate that is to understand what happened to them under the Japanese between 1937 and 45. The Japanese are not stupid. They're not going to go to war with Japan. The prime minister in Japan made some stupid remarks, and that woman was slapped down and brought back in line. The Japanese have now what they've always wanted from China, which is access to the Chinese market. The Koreans are not interested in going to war with China, but they have fought 72 wars against the Chinese, and they lost 2. What does that tell you about the Koreans and the Japanese versus the Chinese? The Chinese are not a militarized population. They're not a militaristic people. And their culture doesn't support it. It's not what they worship. If you want to fault the Chinese for something, you can fault them for worshiping material wealth. They see someone like Donald Trump as a genius because he's wealthy. That's a flaw in Chinese culture. But don't try to turn them into some sort of dangerous military enemy. There's no evidence for that. And if I were Chinese, given my past history with the Japanese, and you look at Taiwan, that is the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Japanese during World War II. They don't want us on Taiwan. They don't want our missiles on Taiwan. And they don't want Taiwan to declare independence with the possibility that Taiwan invites foreign military power into the country. So for the Chinese, Taiwan is a very existential matter. We should respect that, just as we should have respected from the very beginning that what happens in Ukraine is existential for Russia. We need to come back to reality and stop believing that we have either the right or the interest to go all over the world imposing our will. And now we come to Venezuela. And the real question is, what are we possibly going to get out of it? And I don't see anything coming out of it. And we forget that the Chinese internally, they have problems. That doesn't mean they're going to collapse, but they've got to deal with them. They've got a problem right now with labor. They want to keep people employed, and the demand for products is dropping. They have a huge trade imbalance all over the place, especially in Europe. They're trying to figure out how to get past this. They want good relations with their clients, with their customers, and that's where they're focused. But unfortunately, we tend to interpret everything with the goal in mind of seeing it in negative terms, justifies in people's minds in Washington the $1 trillion defense budget, which I don't think we can afford even now.
Yeah, Colonel, I always love our chats, and I always love your insights that you share. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show again and providing us with this knowledge and giving us a nice dose of reality here that we just need to hear. And hopefully, videos like this and interviews can help educate our fellow citizens and people around the world that, we do have a lot of people that see things differently than our politicians, our media, and certainly we need to find a way that we can all coexist and work together.
Well, Cyrus, you do a great job, and keep doing it, because inside the Beltway, people that talk like me are judged to be certifiable. In other words, whatever I say along these lines is dismissed out of hand. I just don't understand. But I've been in Northeast Asia, and I've taken the time, the effort, and the trouble to understand the people that live there. And what we think is happening and what is really happening on the ground are completely different. And I don't know how we get to a media that will report the truth. We have no truth. We just have narratives.
Thankfully, people are turning to YouTube and they're turning to citizen journalism, and certainly, having a very credible voice like yourself on our show, it really helps educate a lot more people around the world. So, Colonel, I want to thank you again for your time today. Wish you and your family a happy holidays, and look forward to more episodes and more conversations in 2026.
Same to you. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Everyone, thank you for making it to this point of the video. And we're going to keep an eye on this evolving story and make sure that we give you
Welcome back to the channel. First things first, as we're approaching a new year, there will be a number of changes here on World Affairs and Context. I'm very excited about them. A significant part of my content is migrating over to Substack and Patreon. You're going to see new interviews there. You will see more written content, and there will be more ways for you to engage with my content and chat with me and other subscribers in the subscriber-only chat. It will be a lot of fun. It will be a really great way to connect with like-minded people. I will include the links to my Substack and Patreon in the description box below this video. Make sure that you are subscribed. I look forward to seeing you on those two platforms. Now, let's talk about something that did not dominate headlines, but absolutely should have. China has just rolled out a new strategic roadmap for Latin America and the Caribbean. And this isn't some routine diplomatic update. This is Beijing signaling very clearly that it sees the region as central to the next phase of the global power shift. It goes without saying that China's vision clashes directly with the United States imperialist Monroe Doctrine, just as the Trump administration's aggressive posturing around Venezuela is escalating. This is China's third official policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, by the way, and the first major update since 2016. A lot has changed since then. The world is more fragmented. The United States-China rivalry is more explicit. And the idea of a single US-led global order is no longer taken for granted. And the context matters, because this document isn't just about trade deals or infrastructure projects. It is about how China sees the world and where it believes Latin America fits into it. When you review the document that I'm about to walk you through, you might notice that one of the first things that jumps out is how strongly Beijing frames the region as part of the global South. That is not just a label, it is a political identity. China is positioning Latin America and the Caribbean as a critical force in shaping a multipolar world, one where power is more dispersed, there are multiple centers of powers, and no no single country sets the rules. In my opinion, the language is very telling. Wouldn't you agree? Let me know what you think in the comments below. The document talks about building, and I quote here, a community with a shared future, pushing back against unilateral bullying and hegemony, and embracing a world order that reflects shifting power balances. In other words, this is China saying, the old system is fading, it is gone, and Latin America should be part of what comes next. And naturally, China positions itself to engage with Latin American states. From there, the strategy moves into concrete steps, starting with politics. At the center of China's political expectations is the One China principle. Beijing makes it very clear that Taiwan is a core interest and that it values Latin American governments that recognize that position. In turn, China promises mutual support on issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is about alignment, not just about diplomacy. What's interesting is how broad Beijing wants this political engagement to be. It is not limited to presidents and foreign ministers anymore. China wants deeper ties between legislatures, between political parties and government institutions across the region. And notably, what I would like to point out is that the Chinese Communist Party says that it wants to cooperate with political parties regardless of their ideology. This is so important. Left, right, populist, technocratic, it just doesn't matter. What matters is engagement and long-term influence. This is one of the main differences, in my view, between China's approach to cooperation and what we see in the West. It is not based on ideology. The Chinese approach is not based on ideology, as you can tell. It is based on mutual benefit and respect. Western political elites have always aligned themselves against a common adversary, an ideological adversary, be it the Soviet Union, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, and so many other states. The West has always a monster to fight, and it rarely prioritizes cooperation in spite of differences. Then we get to economics, and this is where things start to move beyond the usual China builds roads and ports narrative. Infrastructure is still central, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, but the financial side of the strategy is where the real shift is happening, in my opinion. Beijing is openly pushing for reduced dependence on the US dollar in regional trade and finance. Here, I would say that this stance, this goal is not really anti-America. This stance is pro-economic sovereignty first and foremost. So for those of us who are in the United States, when we hear this, it doesn't mean that China is attacking the US dollar. Not at all. After the US weaponized its own currency, its own biggest asset, China, Russia, Iran, and a dozen of other sanctioned countries across the world have no choice but to double down on protecting themselves from Brussels and Washington's politics. De-dollarization is one way to accomplish that goal. So it's not surprising that China wants to expand local currency trade, that it wants to promote currency swap agreements, and to deepen cooperation between central banks. The goal is very clear: make it easier for countries in Latin America to trade with China using their own currencies or the yuan, rather than relying on dollars. It is a slow process, of course it is, but it is a direct challenge to the financial architecture that has dominated global trade for decades. Now, add to that the expansion of Chinese banks and Chinese financial institutions, Chinese funding in the region, and you start to see the outlines of a parallel financial ecosystem already taking shape. This is quite fascinating. Security and defense cooperation is another area where the document goes further than many might expect. China is proposing more frequent exchanges between military and defense officials, more visits, more training, and more coordination. Of course, this would be a big challenge to the United States and the region, and it's not just about traditional military cooperation, Beijing is emphasizing areas like counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and peacekeeping, all important areas. All of this is framed under China's Global Security Initiative, which presents itself as an alternative to US-led security frameworks. The message here is very subtle, but it is very powerful. China isn't just an economic partner anymore, it is a security partner too. And slowly but surely, it is positioning itself as such. It is willing to offer cooperation without the political conditions that often come with Western alliances. There are several more equally important dimensions that are discussed in this white paper, such as technology, a very, very important area. There is also a space component and the soft power dimension. To keep this video short, I will continue this discussion over on my Substack and Patreon. Both sites are linked in the video description box below. Follow along and leave a comment with your thoughts on China's new.
Lawmakers say they would consider filing articles of impeachment against Department of Justice officials, most notably Attorney General Pam Bondi, after the partial release of the Epstein files on Friday, many of which were redacted. Representatives Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie co-sponsored a bill requiring the DOJ to release all files related to the investigation into convicted sex offender, the late Jeffrey Epstein.
Since the bill was nearly unanimously passed, the DOJ was legally required to release all the files, but they only released a portion, saying the department needed to finish redacting them to protect the identities of victims or minors. Here was Ro Khanna during speaking on Friday.
Thomas Massie and I will continue to explore all options to fight to make sure that they comply with the law, whether that is holding people in inherent contempt, recommending people for prosecution, recommending impeachment, or private lawsuits.
And here was Thomas Massie on Sunday.
Most expeditious way to get justice for these victims is to bring inherent contempt against Pam Bondi.
I mean, I hate the partisan games in Congress because I'm amongst the people of the large majority of the Americans that feel like Congress is just doing nothing. And so attacking one another, bringing somebody in the Trump administration up on impeachment charges just feels annoying and frustrating and meritless, especially when we just spent, 60 days, people not getting paid and them also not doing their job. So there's a lot that's annoying about that. But I also think, like they said, they had 30 days to release all these files. I know there was a wealth of information and a lot that may be overwhelming, but for somebody at the helm of it, like Pam Bondi, who touted having the book on her desk or whatever the client list, she's the one, she's part of the problem here. So you better come up with a reason and a full she should have been strategically planning the last 30 days out on how she was going to explain not releasing everything from the woman who said she had the client list. I think that is the first thing. And people are rightfully angry. Like there's some redacted files, like we talked about early, that are redacted without explanation, some full pages that are just black. And that's part of the agreement, is that you need to explain why anything would be redacted. Minors, everybody understands. And then people really want answers to, and going back to our earlier conversation, on why he got this deal in 2007 that seemed beneficial to Epstein out of anyone who is such an egregious offender of the law, somebody who we know now from that New York Times article that we talked about earlier, one of his colleagues told the FBI that he had child pornography obsession back then 30 years ago, and nobody was really seriously looking into it. Who was protecting him, who was working alongside him in the government, and what the answers are. And I think the more that Pam Bondi kind of pushes this off and tries to act like this is baseless and meritless and like this may be some kind of witch hunt, the worse that it'll get for her. Because as we've seen between Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, they are relentless in their pursuit of this. I think this will be the defining factor of some of their political lives, how much they've invested in this. We've seen them almost every Sunday or every once a week on a show, one of them talking about specifically this, even when there were several other things happening in the news, big headlines. They stuck to this Epstein case. And so I don't think that they're going to go anywhere. And so this is just going to be constantly, on this, on like just a tick on Pam Bondi's back that she never can get off unless she addresses it head on and properly.
She should have been preparing for it well before the 30 days. She should have been preparing them for release from the beginning of the administration, right? And that obviously didn't happen. She made this bungled this interview about how she had the client list on her desk. And even people within the DOJ and the FBI were sort of pinning the blame on her anonymously for not handling the file situation correctly. And now here we are back at the same place again, where she is rightfully getting some of the blame for the inability to satisfy the appetite of the public, and to do what the law passed by Congress requires, right? And so I understand why they're moving forward with the impeachment articles, but I also very much agree with your complaint that Congress's priorities seem so out of whack right now, where for the Republicans, at least, you would think that they would be singularly focused on codifying Trump's agenda, right? If he signs an executive order, you should immediately introduce a bill in the House or in the Senate to actually make that law so that it doesn't get immediately overturned when the next president comes in and signs a bunch of executive orders just erasing what Trump did. And instead, we're still arguing about ACA subsidies and impeaching Pam Bondi. Like, it just seems so unserious to me. Even Democratic Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia came out and said that he's not interested in looking at impeachment at this time. I am curious about what that means and why the Democrats aren't all on board, whether they think that it's just not going to go anywhere, so it's not worth their time. Maybe they want to continue to have that healthcare fight. I'm not sure. But the fact that someone from the Democratic Party would come out and basically put the brakes on this effort by Ro Khanna is pretty telling, I think, about what we can expect from this, which is probably not a lot.
Well, I think that Democrats have a lot of wind against their back, showing from the last election and understanding that President Trump's approval rating is not that great, understanding that people, even if the overall goal of tariffs are one thing, people are feeling differently about the economy and how he's done so far on that. And I think overwhelmingly, there are a lot of thoughts and feelings, whether strong for or against what President Trump's agenda has been the first year. And Democrats understand that. And so they know that with this wind beneath their wing, if they get some more policy and speak to specific policy that is regional, kind of like Abigail Spanberger did in Virginia, and not talk about President Trump so much, they just use the wind against their backs and talk about those policies, that might be a winning message, rather than try to look like they're going after political foes like they did for the entire last 4 years, attacking Donald Trump almost every day. And as we saw for the highest Democrat in the land running for president, Kamala Harris, that wasn't a winning issue. People wanted you to talk directly to what's happening every day in the economy and what policies you're putting forward. And so I think attacking Pam Bondi or bringing her up in inherent contempt charges will seem like another one of those things that we're constantly criticizing Congress for doing. And they know that as we go into a midterm year, that might not be the best agenda. But I did see with inherent contempt that doesn't actually require Senate approval. So they can move forward if they would like to bring Pam Bondi to make her answer to this stuff. They can move forward without Senate approval, and they'll actually be able to find Pam Bondi daily until the documents are released, which again, I don't know how this all plays out with her actually paying it or what the protocol is after that, but the fact that there'll be a fine that she has to consider or has to justify for days or even weeks will be one of those things that will keep the pressure on for her to do something else. So hopefully she just makes the right decision and follows the law and releases all the documents and explains why this has been such a blank show that everyone's been, when we've been following along for the ride, she's just dragging the American public for the ride. And even as somebody, and I tell Robbie this all the time, I was not interested in pursuing the Epstein files to this degree, right? After he died and after Ghislaine Maxwell was brought to justice, I was kind of like, okay, as I saw the victims move forward, that made me start to think about, oh, wow, there's people that really still think that these files should be fully released. And obviously part of it was just hearing how the Democrats got riled up about what's in there. So I fell for it and was like, wait, what is in there, right? Some of it, which we've seen for years now. But I do think now that we're here, you can't put it back in the bottle. You can't it's already spilled milk, like you can't put it back in. So we have to kind of move forward with what the American public has already had access to and understands. And she has to release all the information and explain why so much hasn't been released yet and why she's not following the law.
Yeah, I mean, the only final point I'll make on this is that I know Robbie says this a lot, and I do agree with him, is that people are probably not going to be satisfied no matter what ultimately comes out, just like people weren't satisfied with the JFK files or whatever else was released. It's just people want there to be a really broad, far-reaching conspiracy, and they want a smoking gun. And with whatever redactions are made, even if there weren't redactions, I think the reality is that if there's a cover-up going on, the cover-up's not going to be explained in the files, right? Like, come on, like the government's just going to release the evidence of their own cover-up. I just think no matter what happens, people are going to be disappointed.
But you do think there might be a cover-up going on?
There might be. I mean, I know. Who's behind it? There could be any number of explanations, right? All right, up next, comedian Tim Dillon shares his take on Erica Kirk.
Prepares to release more documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. The department is facing intense criticism over the slow pace of the rollout and the heavy redaction in the initial batch of files. The DOJ says it erred on the side of, quote, over redaction to protect victims of Epstein. Yesterday, the Justice Department republished a photo taken from Epstein's home that featured an image of President Trump. It was deleted Saturday, but reappeared Sunday, with the DOJ saying it temporarily removed the picture to make sure it didn't show any victims. The heavy redactions and drip of the documents release has angered the bipartisan lawmakers behind the Epstein files legislation. They're now threatening contempt proceedings against Attorney General Pam Bondi. Listen.
The quickest way, and I think most expeditious way to get justice for these victims is to bring inherent contempt against Pam Bondi.
We're building a bipartisan coalition, and it would fine Pam Bondi for every day that she's not releasing these documents.
Joining me now, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson. We heard Republican Congressman Thomas Massey, who is also behind pushing this forward, say that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law has been broken, something that many Democrats agree with. What's the recourse here, as you started to see there, what they're going to potentially, what they could do, but they have to have bipartisan support, obviously.
Yes, they must. So, Sarah, good morning to you. What happens is generally the recourse, the remedy, when you're not complying with the law, is in the law itself. The unfortunate thing here is that there is no provision in this law that gives a specific remedy. And so what they have to do, that is Congress, is look for ways in which they could bring enforcement. The law is very clear. The law indicates you have records, communications, you have documents that are to be released. It's called the Transparency Act. It's called that because it really envisions the information coming out to the public. It also says you have 30 days to do so. It also says, Sarah, that after those 30 days, 15 days later, you're to report to Congress with respect to the redactions, the categories of them, why you redacted them, what was the purpose, etc. So what you're looking for is compliance. So what I believe, and they've been floating this, you heard there, either contempt proceedings, impeachment proceedings, but something to bring teeth to the notion that what we said to do in the law, which, by the way, it passed in the House less one vote, right? I mean, there was only one person that didn't vote for it, and unanimous in the Senate. So this is something that the public is screaming for.
Yeah, I want to talk about the 15 or so files that were taken down a day after they were posted, which included a photograph of President Trump, Melania, Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Here's what the DOJ said the reasoning was for pulling down those images. It says, out of an abundance of caution, the Department of Justice temporarily removed the image for further review. After the review, it was determined there was no evidence that any Epstein victims were depicted in the photograph, and it has been reposted without any alteration or redaction. I mean, when you look at this sort of push and pull, it's like they put it out, they take it back, they put it out. What does this tell you about the process they are using to deal with an enormous amount, to be fair, an enormous amount of files and documents.
Yeah, I think there's a concern amongst the public about whether there is a cover up or whether this is being done in good faith, whether you have Clinton's name mentioned so many times. It's not about politics and who should be mentioned, who shouldn't. It's about complete accountability. The law speaks to who are the government officials and others who were named and who were not. And when you look at this, Sarah, I think it's important very briefly to look at the timeline. Everyone's Clinton, Clinton, Clinton. The reality is that Epstein, the public investigation, began in 2005, right? Clinton served 92 to 2000. And then you look at him actually being accountable in Florida, if you could call it accountability, in 2009. Some believe that he escaped justice in a very significant way. And then, of course, 2019 is ultimately when he was indicted, died a year later. And so I think that if you're going to release it, for law's sake, release it so they're not conspiracy theories. And if you're going to redact it, of course you want to redact sensitive victim information. Of course, classified should not be there. It says it in the law itself. But everything else, really, if it's not child pornography, et cetera, should just be given to the public and let the people decide. And when it comes out in a disjointed way, when it looks like you're preserving and protecting people, I think those are when conspiracy theories abound, and perhaps they should.
Yeah, there were a lot of talk about, the pictures of Clinton, Bill Clinton, and then you had this one picture that showed Trump, which, by the way, people had seen before, that was taken out. It does ramp up those folks that believe a conspiracy or a cover-up is happening. And we will see what happens going forward. There are many, many more files that still must be released. And I know we'll have you back. Joey Jackson.
Looking forward.
Do appreciate you.
Joining us now is the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jamie Raskin. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's great to see you. Is this a cover-up?
Well, sure. I mean, if you read the statute, the only things they're allowed to be redacting are related to child sex abuse, physical abuse, ongoing investigations, which they say there are none, and national security. So how can you block out an entire document? It makes no sense. And remember, Trump opposed the legislation up until the very end when he could read the writing on the wall. Then he said, oh, I'm for it. They've decided they're just going to try to obstruct the implementation of the legislation. So that's the fight that we're in now.
Do you think the 30-day time frame for release of these documents was realistic?
Well, yeah, given that they came to us back in July and said they'd been through all the documents and they couldn't find any basis for bringing any other lawsuits, they'd already scrutinized them.
What of this do you think falls into the category of protecting victims, and what falls into the category of cover up? Because obviously there is a very strong interest in making sure the victims are protected.
Yeah, I'd say probably 0 and 100. They've not shown any deference or respect for the victims at all, for the survivors of this nightmare. And it's all about covering up things that, for whatever reason, Donald Trump doesn't want to go public, either about himself, other members of his family, friends, Jeffrey Epstein, or just the social business cultural network that he was involved in for at least a decade, if not longer.
So do you think this actions that the Department of Justice are taking on this are specifically designed to protect Donald Trump?
Well, what else? I mean, that's their whole business model. In fact, they're trying to reorganize American constitutional jurisprudence and the rule of law around the idea that the entire executive branch serves one guy. That's the unitary executive theory, that this is all about serving whatever Donald Trump wants. So yeah, I can't imagine what other interests they have in mind.
One of the things we did see were a number of pictures of former President Bill Clinton with Jeffrey Epstein, with Ghislaine Maxwell in a jacuzzi, swimming in a pool. How do you explain that connection, and are you comfortable with it?
I mean, I have no idea. This is why we want to get to the bottom of it and get all of the facts out to to the public. I mean, that's what this is about. And, look, there are clearly lots of people that are in photographs with Jeffrey Epstein. And in addition to being a child sex predator and an international child sex abuse trafficker, he was very much of a socialite and a sycophant and a panderer to different people. So there's lots of people who've appeared in those contexts, and we shouldn't be covering up for anybody if they were actually involved in criminality. And otherwise, it's embarrassing to people, but the Congress has said we don't want the suppression of materials simply because somebody may be embarrassed. I mean, Bill Clinton has appeared, along with Donald Trump, along with Noam Chomsky, and other people from different aspects of our society. But what we're looking at is, how did a global, decades-long, billion-dollar sex ring go undetected and unpoliced for such a long period of time? This is about a double system of justice. Remember, he was convicted back in 2008, but that didn't stop him from going forward and continuing to run the whole network.
I mean, Republicans would probably sit here and say, well, why didn't you do this when Joe Biden was president of the United States, when you had the power?
Well, if they ask me personally, I can produce for you, as I've produced for them, a number of letters I wrote, including a hearing I did as a subcommittee chair on the Oversight Committee about Alex Acosta and the double system of government that we saw back in Florida. Remember, there was a 60-count federal indictment ready to go on this international child sex trafficking ring, with all kinds of counts, including the money laundering, the conspiracy, the prostitution, and so on. And Alex Acosta cast the whole thing overboard and came back with one state count of solicitation in Florida to benefit Epstein and his friends. And there was really a cover-up of other people who were involved as part of that plea bargain agreement. And I've got the letters to show how I was demanding hearings on that back in 2018, 2019. So that's just phony. In any event, accusing somebody else of hypocrisy doesn't demonstrate that you're actually interested in getting to the bottom of the crime. And that's what we need to be doing here.
Are you planning to sue the Justice Department to release the rest of these files?
It's not clear that we've got standing to do that. Speaker Johnson would clearly have standing to do that on behalf of the whole House of Representatives. The court rules about standing of individual members or the minority caucus are very restrictive and hostile. So we're going to be doing whatever we can to elevate this, to keep it in the public imagination, and to demand that they turn the documents over. But if it's possible, we will be bringing litigation, but we're trying to work that through right now.
We've been saying that this whole Epstein release would be nothing but theater, that they would find a way to basically hide everything that matters, all while pretending to give us something important. And when I say we, I'm not talking about me specifically. I'm talking about you, talking about me. I'm talking about all of us, the people who saw this for what it was, political theater. Because December 19th was supposed to be the day. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, the one that passed with near unanimous support, it required that the DOJ would publish all unclassified records and documents pertaining to the Epstein investigation. And the law that was passed that Trump signed specifically prohibited withholding anything based on embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity. And yet, they still found a way. Okay. And we said they would this whole time, right? I mean, nobody actually thought that the full Epstein files would ever come out, because if it did, it would send shockwaves through the entire world, right? And what they delivered was nothing but redaction theater. They think we're dumb. They think we're all fools. They think that people don't realize that what they gave us is nothing, because 80% of what was released on December 19th was already mostly in the public record. They just republished court records that have already been existing from different cases. Documents that have been floating around for years have been dressed up as new revelations and released. But that's not what people wanted. And it's obvious now. Everybody's asking the question, what are they hiding? And that's a valid question, right? I'm sure you're asking the same thing. What are they hiding? I mean, I think we kind of know what they're hiding, but the names, the network, the whole thing, how deep it actually goes, and this so-called client list that apparently exists and doesn't exist at the exact same time, because some people are saying, oh, there's no client list. Other people are saying, yes, there is a client list, and we have the documents right here. So what's happening, right? Is there a civil war happening behind the scenes? I think the indication is, yes, there is something going on, and the powers that be are fighting this release with tooth and nail. What could possibly justify this level of coordinated obstruction, right? Where both parties, despite the public outcry, seem to be equally motivated to keep this thing behind the curtain, to keep this thing buried forever. What could it be? Well, I think the answer is a little bit darker and a little bit more spiritual than the general public has been led to believe. And there's one survivor, I think her name was Juliette Bryant, and she might have given us the answer. Now, I'm going to play this interview, but real quick, I'm going to talk about it first. So what she described and what she actually witnessed firsthand, it matches testimonies going back thousands of years. Think about that. She saw something that matches the stuff that we read in the Bible. And she described something that most people, the majority of people, would go on to dismiss immediately. But the people who know, the people who actually look at this through the lens of critical thinking, well, it made them perk up a little bit, because what she said matches testimony, like I said, that dates back thousands of years and spans the entire earth. She said that during an encounter in Epstein's bedroom, a room that she described as always being like really dark and cold, she witnessed something spectacular. She witnessed something unbelievable and something that shakes the core of reality itself. What was that? What did she witness? She said that she witnessed a transformation, a shape-shifting. That's right. Epstein actually turned into something else. Now, before you are like, wait, what are you talking about? This is crazy. I don't want to listen to this crazy stuff. Just hear me out, because this is not an isolated incident, and people have been recording this phenomena for eons. And watch this clip. Here she's going to describe it.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me. We've had a conversation several years ago, and I just want to try and put you at your ease. I know you don't particularly feel comfortable talking about this publicly. It's a hard thing for you to talk about. I appreciate you coming back on Uncensored. Just first of all, as one of the
Well, speaking about this matter, because it needs to be touched on.
Yes.
The more people that speak about it, the better. So thank you very much.
Yes. Well, I just
I have high respect for you. I think you're an amazing man. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's just remind our viewers who may not be familiar with your story. Just summarize your experience at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, what happened was I was doing modeling. I was a young girl. I was studying psychology at the University of Cape Town. I started doing modeling, to earn income. I got scouted when I was 14 by elite model management. In fact, my mother wouldn't let me model then. She only let me do it when I was older. But what happened was I was approached at a bar in Cape Town by a girl, and she said that she was here with the King of America. His name was Jeffrey Epstein, and he was here with Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker. She said that Epstein was best friends with Leslie Wexner, who owned Victoria's Secret, and it would be very beneficial for me to meet them for my modeling career. Because I came from Africa, I found a camera there, and also there's flight logs. I found a digital camera, one of those throwaway cameras in the kitchen there. I took a few of them and I took photos. So I've got evidence, and also there's evidence from them flying me there. But you see, a lot of girls who were just walked there to his apartment in Palm Beach, they won't have evidence. So basically, only the girls who have solid evidence have been compensated.
And obviously, Epstein is dead. Do you believe he took his own life?
Not obviously, Piers. It's not obvious. He might be alive. I want to know what those bastards did to me. When I got back from there, I was not okay. I was taken to hospital 10 times with panic attacks through my 20s. I felt I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die every day. I know they did something more to me. Epstein shapeshifted in front of me. It's very hard to understand if you haven't seen it, but I saw it. I want to be lie detected on this. But I've never seen anyone else turn into anything like that. And it happened. It was like a weird hologram, and it had like big black eyes. And I also saw Epstein shapeshift on the island. When I was on the island, I saw Epstein like suddenly, and people have actually asked some pretty good questions recently. It wasn't like I saw him turning like the Incredible Hulk. What happened is, it was when I was taken in the bedroom the one time, and he had like a blanket up to here, And then I looked away and I looked at him, and suddenly it wasn't him anymore. It wasn't like I saw him turning. It was like it was him. And I looked away, and then when I looked back, it wasn't him. It was this weird creature. And then I looked away, and then I looked back, and it was him again. You know, and I can't really explain that. I mean, I can explain it as well as I can, and I can understand, you know, if someone else told me this, like I keep saying, I wouldn't believe it. I totally wouldn't. I'd be like, okay, this person's either mad or they were on drugs or something. But the problem is that I saw it, and I wasn't on drugs.
Isn't this crazy? Think about this. She said that she was stone cold sober when she saw this transformation happen. She also said that other victims have reported the exact same experiences or similar experiences. So she's not the only one that saw this thing. Not only is she not the only Epstein victim who saw him do similar things, but she's also not even close to the only person in our history as human race that has witnessed these types of things happen, because this is a common occurrence throughout the entire world. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. But I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking this lady's insane. You're thinking this sounds like some sort of science fiction movie, some sort of maybe it's a trauma-induced hallucination. It's false memories. Maybe something was slipped into her food or her water. Maybe somebody slipped her a Mickey, right? Maybe she was seeking attention. Maybe she made the whole thing up. But I don't think she did, because I had those same exact reactions at first, and I believe in this stuff. Now, I'm not one of those people like David Icke that believes that there's like a race of reptilians. You know, maybe he's right. I don't know, but I'm just not on that same page as he is. But I believe in this woman's testimony. And I actually saw something like that with my own eyes years ago, long before I was saved. I saw something very similar happen. And I'll tell that story later. A lot of you guys have already seen it, but this is what changed my mind about this specific story. And that is that every culture worldwide on planet Earth has documented this same exact phenomenon. Every continent, every major civilization, going back to the earliest human records that we have. So this is not just like a similar occurrence. This isn't something that sounds like what she said. No, it's not just some tradition. No, this is the same thing, guys. This is the same features, the same behaviors, and the same conditions under which these transformations allegedly occur. So there's a cave painting in southern France. I think scholars date it to 13,000 years ago, but that can be debated. It's not about the date that they date this cave painting to. It's about what it depicts. And somebody crawled deep into this cave system. Mind you, it's pitch black in there, and they painted on the wall. Well, what did they paint? Scholars will call it the sorcerer, and it depicts a figure caught in like a mid-transformation. Basically, it has human figures that are blending with animal figures. It's basically twisted between two states of being. And researchers believe it represents like the physical moment of metamorphosis. This is the oldest depiction of what we would now call shapeshifting. And guys, every culture around the world believes in something like this. Shapeshifting. Entities that masquerade as people, entities that use people as masks, that use people as meat suits, so to speak. So whoever drew this painting in the cave thought it was important enough to record for all of history to see. And that's exactly what happened. But that's not the only place that you see stuff like this. But this tradition, it spans the entire world. And from that French cave, you can trace these accounts through every major civilization. Like I said, you can even take it back to ancient Babylon, where the Babylonians documented these encounters with entities that were transforming into something else. And they even built temples to appease them. The Egyptians, they depicted not only their gods with hybrid forms, right? Think about Anubis, but their demons as well, beings of chaos with features that would match what Bryant said Epstein did. So here you have these ancient cultures drawing entities that are shape-shifting from humans to animal, vice versa, some sort of beings that are transforming into something else. And then you have the Greek myth. What is it? King Lycaon or something like that. He transformed into a wolf as some sort of punishment, and basically the first werewolf. And there's also been documented encounters with beings that they call daemons. We know them as demons. And the Bible lays this out as well. We have Ephesians 6:12 that says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. So what was working behind Epstein, through Epstein, Epstein was just a vessel for this ancient evil. And remember, the book of Revelation talks about that the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent, the devil. Again, you have dragon, you have serpent. not metaphorical language. You have specific imagery that has been preserved through prophetic visions. In the Garden of Eden, when Satan tempted Eve, he was called the Nakash in Hebrew. The Hebrew term there for serpent is Nakash. So if Satan, who is a fallen angel, can appear to be a serpent or in serpentine form, so here you have Satan, who's a fallen angel, and according to the Bible was one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful created being in all of existence, he can turn himself into a serpent, just like Epstein did. Okay. So was Epstein utilizing these dark spiritual powers? Was there fallen angels possessing him? Because we know that fallen angels can, specifically Satan, can possess people. He possessed Judas. And what happened to Judas? In that exact instance, we would have the same thing that this woman saw Epstein do. A man, Judas, possessed by a spirit, Satan, who looks like a serpent. The Garden of Eden. All right. So this whole thing can connect to itself. I'm not saying that Epstein was some sort of fallen angel. Maybe he was. Maybe he was possessed. I don't know. All I'm saying is that her testimony is very suspicious. And the fact that they are refusing to give us these redacted files, I think it has something to do with what this woman saw, something about his true nature. Maybe he wasn't just a regular man. And it's clear throughout our human history, most people that ever lived on the earth believed in these things. They believed these things were not only possible, but true. In medieval Europe, for instance, they didn't just believe these accounts, they documented them extensively. For example, you have one called the Canon Episcopa, I believe it's called, from 900 AD. And then you have the witch trials, right? All the different witch trials that happened throughout the 1600s. But there was endless testimonies from back then, from the old times, from the medieval period, of people describing the exact same occurrence that this woman described seeing Epstein transform into. This is basically a consistent testimony that spread across the entire world. And guys, we're not just talking about medieval Europe here. This goes a lot farther than that. Let's look at the Navajo people, for instance. They have zero connections with medieval Europe. Before the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they had their own, I call them myths, but I don't think they're myths. They had their own stories of people that could transform, exactly like the cave painting, exactly like the testimonies that came out in the Middle Ages during these witch trials and during these other things, testimonies that people saw with their own eyes and that were documented throughout history. The Navajo people, the Anasazi people of ancient Southwest America say the same exact things. But these were called skinwalkers. The legend of the skinwalker coincides with exactly what this woman saw, and it coincides with exactly what is written in the Bible, and it coincides with every culture worldwide. And according to the Navajo tradition, these skinwalkers, they're not born in another realm, another dimension. No, they were once human who gained power through transformation, through specific abilities, and through specific initiations. They imbued themselves with the dark spiritual black magic that exists beyond the veil, basically empowering themselves in a way that they can utilize that power, that dark energy, for their own nefarious purposes. It's a very specific thing. And what's the initiation? What's the specific thing that these Navajo people have to do to become a skinwalker? Well, of course, it's something evil, right? And in this case, we're talking about, in order to be imbued with this dark, evil power, you have to murder your own family member. And most occasions, it's a sibling. Stop and think about that, all right? The requirement for gaining this power, this shape-shifting power from the dark side, is betraying your own, is killing your own blood and your own family. What does that even sound like to you? Because it should remind you of something. It reminds me of something. But this reminds me exactly of the Babylonian human sacrifice that people had to give to ancient gods like Moloch. I say gods, like small g gods. Moloch was a demon. He demanded child sacrifice. And cultures have been sacrificing people to these ancient deities for millennia. And in the Navajo tradition, the skinwalkers, they're described as having black eyes or black glowing eyes, and something's wrong with their face. It seems wrong. It seems off. Sometimes it's enlarged. Sometimes it's distorted. It's like a hologram. Supernatural speed. They can run super fast. There's so many stories of skinwalkers running through the desert at night, keeping up with cars, basically stalking people who are driving going like 60 miles an hour. They can also mimic. They have the ability to basically like a deep fake, a spiritual deep fake. They can pretend to be somebody. Remember in Terminator 2, when John Connor, he called his mom, but the T-1000 was there. He had the spike in his stepdad or whatever, and he was utilizing his mom's voice, pretending to be his mom. but it was just a Terminator. It was a T-1000. Well, that's what the skinwalkers can do. And not only that, they're able to transform themselves at will, especially during these heightened states of like ritual ceremonies. The darker their deeds are, the darker their ceremonies or their sacrifices are, the more power they can get. And there's even geographical places on Earth where this type of phenomena can be documented more frequently than other places. And Skinwalker Ranch is a perfect example. There have been multiple witnesses that say they've seen shape-shifting entities come out of the ranch. This is a common thing. And no, I'm not just talking about the TV show. There's been reports of this long before the TV show, going back centuries. And the phenomenon continues to this day up there in that ranch because, well, there's probably a portal there, but that's a whole different story. There's even one specific story. The previous owner of Skinwalker Ranch, back when it was called the Sherman Ranch, I think it was a Sherman family. When they first moved onto the ranch, they had a cattle farm. The father and son they heard their cattle freaking out. They went outside and they saw a wolf. They described it. And this is documented in a book that's been written about several times. It's a true story, according to the Shermans anyway. They saw this wolf that was like huge. It was bigger than a man. It was like the biggest wolf they've ever seen. So they shot it. I think he had a 357 Magnum, if I remember correctly. He emptied the gun into this wolf, and the wolf didn't make a noise. It just turned around and walked away and disappeared into the night. But they claimed that that wolf was acting human-like. It was standing up and it was looking at them directly in the eye, standing on 2 feet. And remember, this wasn't just a regular-sized wolf. It was bigger than a man. So you have this giant animal standing on its feet, and the man empties a 357 Magnum into it and nothing happens. It just walks away. The animal didn't react whatsoever. It got shot several times and just left. It just walked away. And there have been several other sightings at that specific location on Skinwalker Ranch of shape-shifting beings. And furthermore, the man, one of the government whistleblowers, who is one of the guys who's coming out in favor of UAP disclosure, but he said he has a story, and he wrote about this. He talks about this openly, that when he came back from Skinwalker Ranch, something followed him. It was the hitchhiker effect. He called it a wolf man. There was a wolf man, basically a werewolf. What we're talking about here appeared in his backyard. He saw it. And this is a man that's, he calls himself a scientist. I wouldn't go that far, but this is a highly credentialed man who has seen this shape-shifting figure in his backyard. And stories like this transcend boundaries, right? They transcend cultures. It goes beyond specific locations and specific beliefs, and it's become kind of a universal story in our human existence. And it's clear this is the same evil, just under a different name. And I believe Epstein was part of that whole thing. Now, is this the reason why they redacted the files? Because if it comes out that he is part of that whole thing, and there was some sort of spiritual power that he was imbued with, well, I think it would be too devastating. So they redacted everything. So they buried it. So they're never going to release those files. And guys, if you believe this witness testimony who saw Epstein shapeshift, well, it changes everything. Because in that case, Epstein would be an essential figure in this overarching story that goes from the pre-flood world to ancient Babylon, through history, through time itself, until modern times. And it connects our whole past together. So let's return back to December 19th, right? Let's return back to those blanked out pages. And what are they hiding? Maybe they're hiding the names. Maybe they're hiding the billionaires. Maybe they're hiding the people who are still running the country, the people who are behind the stock market, all the hedge fund managers, the CEOs of these major trillion-dollar corporations, politicians, intelligence agencies, whatever it may be. Multiple researchers have documented that people like that are involved with Epstein. So maybe that's why they're redacting it. Maybe it's some sort of institutional self-preservation technique that they're doing. These bureaucrats are covering each other's butts, because throughout decades of neglect, it's starting to come back and bite them. Maybe, right? Maybe it's just cowardice on a scale that we've never seen before, right? Seems plausible. Or maybe it's something else, something darker, something ancient, and it's not the who that's involved, it's the what. Because maybe, just maybe, what they can't tell us, what they can't let us see, is the actual nature of what's happening. And the nature of what's happening, it proves that our reality is not exactly as it appears to be on the surface. Because if Juliette Bryant is telling the truth, and I believe she is, right? And I honestly, guys, I don't know if she is telling the truth. I just believe she is. So who knows? But if she is telling the truth, then you have, thousands and thousands of years of consistent human testimony across every culture that does suggest that Epstein He wasn't just some trafficker. No, he was something darker, something ancient, and something far more evil than anybody could ever imagine. And I told you that I have a personal story where I witnessed something like this in real life. And yes, I have seen a woman's eyes turn black. And I think it was similar to what this woman saw Epstein do. Now, this was quite a while ago. I think it was 2015. I was working at a nightclub. Let's just say it was a nightclub, right? I was a security guard. And one night, I think it was around 3 in the morning, this woman comes in, and we didn't allow women at this nightclub. If women could come in if they were escorted by a man, but we didn't allow women in there by themselves. And she came in, she was trying to get in. I'm like, sorry, I can't let you in. And she's like, oh, I know so and so, let me in, blah blah blah. She's like naming names. I'm like, can't. And I was just strict with her. I wasn't mean or anything. I was just like, sorry, I can't let you in. And no matter what she said, sorry, I can't do it. And so she turned around and she starts walking out. And as she was walking out, she turned around like this and looked at me, and she smiled like this big grin. And when she did that, her eyes were totally black, just blacked out eyes. It was like a split second. She was looking like this, just smiling, big toothy grin, black eyes. And then she turned around and walked out. And what happened was, a few minutes later, there was these taxi cab drivers coming in. And by the way, when that happened, it was like a creepiest thing ever. It was like, I was shocked because I knew what I was seeing. And I didn't know like what to think of it at the time. I was like, what is going on here? Just like shocked. It was just like a cold stun. You know what I mean? I just didn't know what to do. So I just stood there like, okay, that was so weird. She left. I was so like freaked out by it. I wasn't scared or anything. I was just like shocked. And then a few minutes later, these taxi drivers came in, and the taxi drivers were regulars at that club. Like whenever the bars would close, the taxi drivers would take the people home. And then after that, ours was the last one that was open. So they would all congregate around there. So they would come in basically every night. And this lady, this woman, she knew some of the taxi drivers. So they became her escort. So she came in with them. And when she walked back, she just looked at me. Her eyes were back to normal, but she just looked at me like, haha, I got in anyway, and went and sat down with them. So that was my experience with seeing a woman's eyes turn black. Have you ever had any experiences like that? Have you seen it happen? If you have, put it in the comment. But the bottom line here, guys, is that this is a pattern, right? This is a pattern that we can trace without being repetitive, that we can trace throughout history. And the Bible talks about this. So if this is true, what else is true, right? Does that mean everything else in the Bible is true too? Yes, it does. And I believe God will win at the end. This is a war. This is a spiritual battle. And the Lord, he's going to win. He's going to smite these people and these entities behind these people in the final judgment. It will happen one day. Who knows when it will happen, but the final battle will be between the Lord and them. And they don't stand a chance. They're done. They're going to get thrown into the lake of fire where that's it. They're going to face the second death. And sorry, sucks to be them. You had the truth and you rejected it. What happens to you next is on you. You made the decision. So what do you guys think about this? Do you believe this woman's testimony? Do you believe that she saw Epstein's eyes actually transform and him transform into like a shapeshifter? And if you do, what are the implications of that? Please put it into the comments below.
Cultfigga. Follow me.